Hi guys, welcome back to another exciting video, so sit back, relax, and let's get started. I do not. The teen hummed out. Taking his phone out of his back pocket, he typed in his address into the search bar almost instantly. A set of directions popped up on the screen. So he hit the go button and started walking. He had meandered a bit far from his house and was about a 20-minute walk away. But he wouldn't complain if it meant avoiding his pursuers until tomorrow. As he followed his phone, and Gami followed him, they passed a beach covered in what looked to be trash. If it weren't for the sight of the ocean, they would have had a hard time figuring out that it was indeed a beach, but the ghost seemed to recognize it and stopped abruptly when the boy didn't feel his mentor's signature air behind him. He also stopped and turned to see what made the spirit pause. "What is it, Gami?" he questioned with a curious expression. "Do you know this place?" But the man made no response. Instead, he floated over to the entrance and stopped near a large stone right before the slope. Midoriya continued after him and walked over to the stone as well. He watched as the specter ran his hand over the top of the rock, but after closer inspection, he realized that it wasn't a rock that Gami was pondering, but actually an extremely weathered chunk of concrete. He moved to stand next to the spirit and finally got a look at the front of the slab. It was heavily graffitied, but he could still make out the plated sign pressed into the concrete. Dagaba Municipal Beach Park. Midoriya hadn't heard of this beach before. "What happened to this place?" Gami whispered so hoarsely, the boy almost didn't hear it. "What do you mean? Do you know this place?" he repeated again. He paused, unsure of how to continue. "I used to come here." The teen's head swung towards the man in shock. "What? I don't understand." By the ghost's reaction, Midoriya figured he didn't really get it either. "I think I used to come here before I was a death." That comment really made the boy's head spin. Gami had a lot of difficulty recalling his life before becoming a death, so much so that the teen was afraid he'd forget details of his own life as well. For the man to feel such a pull to such a desecrate spot had to mean something. So he pressed the specter to continue. "Can you remember anything more?" The spirit didn't respond immediately. Still staring blankly at the battered sign, he then motioned to grab at the small gray stone that hung limply around his neck. Midoriya had tried to help the man figure out why he had such an item tied around his neck. It was really the only defining feature concerning the specter. Gami could never remember why he had it on himself, but couldn't shake the fact that it was important. This came from here." He gestured to the stone and then the trashed beach. And now he was sure that his brain was doing somersaults in his skull. Never had the ghost remembered so much in so little time, so he tugged on one of the man's long sleeves urgently. "Well then, what are we waiting for?" he cried out. "Come on." The green-haired boy pulled Gami down the beach's sloped entrance onto the warm sand. They carefully stepped over lone pieces of discarded trash as they made their way to the water. The specter seemed to still be in shock, though, struggling to grasp this newfound information. "I do not remember this place looking this way. I do not think it was this dirty." Curiously, Midoriya pulled out his phone. He opened a new tab and typed in the name he had read on the sign. Within moments, he was met with a numerous amount of articles all referencing that specific name. Scrolling through some of them, he got a pretty good idea about the beach's late history. "Well, it looks like this section of the beach has been like this for years," he informed, Gami suddenly finding interest in his successor's words. "Turns out a lot of the currents around here lead to this shore. People use that knowledge to dump their trash here illegally, but it's hard for law enforcement to track down those who do." Oh, the teen could hear the dejection in his mentor's voice. This place had obviously meant something to the man, and it saddened both of them to know it had gotten in such disrepair. After who knows how long he looked around at all the trash, there was such an array of items to be found. From household garbage to large kitchen appliances, the piles of stuff stretched high above the beach, blocking out any view from the above sidewalk. A sudden idea popped into the boy's head. "This place isn't a bad area to practice DT," he observed, shortening the name of his signature ability. "I could really get some training done here." The spirit perked up. "The piles of trash are tall enough for me to practice with my scythe too. I wouldn't have to worry about anyone seeing me." Midoriya pulled up the beach's official address, and after a few taps, he saved it into his phone. "I think we'll be coming back here for a good while." And unexpectedly, Gami hugged the teen from behind at his last statement, unsure of what to do. He smiled and burrowed his face into one of the sleeves wrapped around his upper chest, hoping it would be enough of a gesture for the man to understand his action was acknowledged. Midoriya knew there were only about 10 months until the UA entrance exam, so finding a place to train was very much a necessity. Discovering Dagaba Municipal Beach Park was like a little gift from Lady Luck herself. Sure, the boy was ecstatic at identifying a secure, isolated place to practice his abilities, but at realizing the true meaning of the obscure coastline, he could feel his excitement stem from a different source. It made him feel bubbly with pride at seeing the normally stoic man so genuinely happy. Midoriya made frequent trips to Dagaba Beach after school and on the weekends. At first, he was unsure of how to balance training his decay rate and his scythe skills, but Gami revealed that he could do both at the same time. Upon finding out that he could share DT with his weapon, the teen felt he just tackled two birds with one stone. Although there were a few specifics that made for interesting moments and funny fails. First off, it was made painfully obvious that he couldn't decay his own scythe. It was probably the only thing DT couldn't destroy, which was pretty advantageous, but during incidents where Midoriya got extra frustrated with his weapon, he couldn't break the stupid thing. Chucking it at the ocean was the best he could do, but it wasn't nearly as satisfying as it sounded. Second, he could share his decaying ability with the scythe, but the weapon could only decay what it cut. Trying to practice this turned out to be a pain in the boys behind. He was initially excited to swing at the refrigerators and large cuts of metal, but after having his scythe bounce off the first fridge he struck, he realized the amount of force needed for him to cut the metal was going to leave him sore each morning after. But other than that, the teen quite enjoyed practicing with his new signature weapon. He got some good pointers from Gami too, but the man liked to spend his time sitting right by the shore. The way he longingly stared at the sea made Midoriya's heart pang. He would clean up this beach before the entrance exam. He would make sure of it. For Gami. But right now, the boy wasn't working at the municipal beach park. The two were coming from that exact place actually, and headed towards home. The green-haired teen was sweaty and sandy, which was not a comfortable combination, and looking forward to a cold shower. He walked inside, and as expected, there was no one inside. He shuffled over into his bedroom groggily, his muscles aching in distress, but right as he entered, he momentarily forgot all about his stiff limbs. It had been about a week and a half since the sludge villain incident, but the teen still had his face plastered all over his walls. "I still can't believe he said that to me," he stated to no one in particular. Maybe it was to himself. The spirit wasn't sure, to be honest. "It was a shock to us both," he responded in hopes to ease his successor. "But you can succeed without his approval." "Yeah, I know. But that doesn't negate the fact that the #1 hero is some quirkus bigot." "I hear those things all the time, but never would I have expected to hear it from All Might of all people." The teen scowled at the sight of the hero's signature smile. That smile now churned his insides. He really couldn't stand looking at all of this crap anymore. He approached the wall where All Might smiled back at him, and despite being ungodly dirty from his workout, he ripped the poster off the wall. Well, it was more of a forceful pull as to not damage the merchandise. Sure, Midoriya was angry at them, but he had enough common sense to realize that the amount of merch in his room would add up to a nice sum of cash. He continued taking down the posters on his wall, and once he finished with that, he moved to stripping his closet of any All Might-themed clothing he could find, which was the majority of everything in there sadly, but pretty much all of the clothes were in good condition, as the boy had been careful to not dirty them when he did wear them in the past. Then he moved on to cleaning his bookshelves of any other miscellaneous merchandise, including figures, headbands, charms, and pens. All in all, he was able to fill the corner of his room thoroughly with stuff. And while he was disgusted that he had owned so much of the man's merch, the amount of money it was inevitably worth did make owning it somewhat worth it. Now, his room was almost completely blank, his 2 bookshelves empty except for the plentiful notebooks he had. He had written 13 analysis notebooks, but those were only on heroes. The teen had tons of other books pertaining to interesting quirks, quirk theory, and his own abilities. The vast amount of notebooks he did have filled a good portion of one of the bookcases, but that still left one bookshelf completely empty and another one only half full. His walls were now completely bare, having once been covered in All Might paraphernalia. Midoriya could tell where his posters had been. The walls now two-toned due to the difference in light exposure. He figured he could just get other hero merchandise to cover the blankness, but he really wasn't feeling all too hyped about heroes as of late. Maybe he'd look into some Eraserhead merch. But the man was so secretive, he doubted he'd be able to find enough to cover all the spots where his All Might posters had gone. He filed that Eraserhead idea away for later. Maybe he might not find any mainstream stuff concerning the underground hero, but there was bound to be handmade merchandise created by individuals. Sure, it might end up being expensive, but that just went to show the mass amount of time and effort that went into each product. His desk was looking pretty clean for once. Storage had always been a problem for Midoriya when he collected All Might items, but now that he was getting rid of them, the desk looked strangely organized. Maybe he could invest some of the cash he would get from selling his All Might stuff into some storage options. He would need it considering the size of his room, especially if he found an obsessive passion again. Though, the boy knew he would have to go shopping for clothes. The percentage of his clothing that was All Might themed was well over half, and now that it was finally out of his closet, he would need some new wear. All he really had now were a few pairs of shorts and some shirts that had English statements in them. He enjoyed wearing those shirts out, since most people wouldn't understand what they read, and for the people who did, they got a good laugh, of course. They were nothing offensive or perverse, just stupidly obvious statements, because who didn't get a kick out of a t-shirt saying t-shirt on it in English? But now that he was done with his mini tantrum, Midoriya was off to take a shower. He especially needed to wash the grime and the All Might off him for good. A fresh, new start was just the thing he was looking for anyway. Midoriya walked down one of the suburban streets on his way to Ishihara's home. It had been a few days after he cleaned out his room, but the teen still hadn't found anything to redecorate with. As for the All Might merchandise, he had been able to sell a good chunk of it online successfully at first. The boy didn't look forward to meeting up with the individuals interested in purchasing something from him. Those meetings were very short and just consisted of giving the item and taking the money, but now Midoriya had gotten more comfortable with confronting the strangers, even going as far as to make some small talk. Gami was proud that his successor was finally stepping out of his shell, even if it wasn't by much. The merch was more valuable than he had expected when he began selling the stuff to the highest bidder. The teen really wasn't anticipating anything to go over the initial price he posted it at, nor for mass amounts of people to fight for it, but it turned out that his stuff was worth much more than he thought. Not that he was complaining. The teen put away most of his extra cash, but he did use some of it to get a new backpack. He'd had his yellow backpack for almost 8 years, and it was definitely obvious the bag was worn and torn from years of use as well as abuse by the rest of his classmates. Midoriya has grown out of the obnoxious yellow, but really didn't have the money to be spending so frivolously, at least not until now. His new backpack was black, made of leather instead of polyester. At first, he wasn't too sure about the leather, but considering that his polyester one was barely hanging on by a thread, he decided that a change from the norm was necessary. Gami had suggested investing in a leather one, and he couldn't deny his bag felt more sturdy and secure. He'd grown to like the feel and look of his new bag. Holding said backpack's thick straps, Midoriya walked up Ishihara's front steps and rang the doorbell like clockwork. The older, brown-haired man opened up the front door and let the boy inside. "Ah, Midoriya," the man called. "It's so good to see you. How are you holding up?" This was the first visit since the sludge villain incident. The teen wanted to take some time away from the older man to pull himself together after the attack. Ishihara was rightfully worried about the boy, but respected his wishes. He still kept their meeting dates, but made sure that Midoriya knew he wasn't obligated to come. "I'm doing okay." "Well, that's good to hear." Ishihara motioned for him to sit on the couch, so he did. The teen shook off his bag and relaxed into the sofa as the man left for the kitchen. It wasn't long before he came back with a tray of cookies and 2 cups of tea. The man placed the food and drinks down onto his coffee table before sitting next to Midoriya on the couch. "So I only saw bits and pieces of the fight on the news." He cut right to the chase. "But I could definitely pick out your trademark green hair anywhere," said green-haired child shuffled on the couch, not really knowing how to respond. "Yeah, that was me." There was a bit more awkward silence after that. Gami stood by another chair across from the two. He tried sitting in it, but fell right through, to which the boy stifled a giggle. He immediately felt more comfortable and made a mental note to thank the ghost later, whether the move was international or not. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Yeah, I kinda do." And so, over the course of a few cookies and the occasional breaks for tea, Midoriya spilled the events of that day in its entirety to Ishihara, starting with the confrontation with Bakugo in the classroom, to the fight beneath the underpass, to the conversation with All Might, and finally ending with the fabled fight from the news. He obviously left out a few of the details of how he took down the sludge villain alone that first time, as well as his premonition minutes before saving Bakugo, and he didn't even mention the final confrontation with All Might. Much less talked about the man's quirk, keeping his promise to the #1 hero. There were tears and much-needed hugs between the two throughout the entire chat, but Ishihara never spoke a word. The older man just let the boy talk, but never pushed for more. The last thing he wanted to do was make him uncomfortable. "I know I don't need All Might's approval, but hearing that from him hurt so much." The teen sniffled, rubbing at his puffy eyes. "I can only imagine," Ishihara replied. "The nerve of that man." He took a small sip from his cup, before turning his gaze directly at Midoriya. "And what about the kids at school?" he questioned. "Are they giving you any trouble? More than usual, I mean." The boy broke eye contact and fiddled with his gloved fingers on his lap. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but didn't actually say anything. The older man frowned. That wasn't a good sign. "Well," the teen started, sorta. He looked over to Gami for reassurance, but the spirit just stared at him. The man made no move for Midoriya to continue, but didn't tell the boy to stop either. Ishihara continued, "More physical or?" No, it's actually a little less physical since the incident. It's more words than anything." The man hummed, taking in his words. Less physical violence was definitely good, but based off of the teen's reaction, it wasn't that good of change overall. Maybe the other children felt threatened by Midoriya's new display of skill, but he didn't think that was the case from what he took from the teen's description. His classmates never felt threatened by him because of his quirkless status. It was actually quite the opposite. Ishihara didn't think that this one exhibit of ability would change the years of bullying he suspected the boy went through. It could be that the kids thought that he was just playing hero, since they obviously didn't think he could be an actual one. Maybe that's why they were having such a volatile reaction to his escapade with the villain. Despite possibly seeing his skill on the news, they were trying to dash any hopes of him succeeding as a hero without a quirk, and upping their ante due to his recent success. Maybe they didn't exactly view it as success, but it was enough of an increase in Midoriya's confidence that they were eager to stop it. "Well, less violence is good," he finally responded. "Yeah, I guess. As for the words, maybe use them as motivation." The boy looked confused. Motivation. Ishihara stood up from the couch and placed his cup onto the coffee table. Well, I'm not saying you have to prove them wrong, but maybe try not to associate their words with negativity. So like use their words as a motivator? Exactly, but don't feel compelled to prove them wrong. Midoriya messed with his hands. He wasn't totally sure if he got the older man point on the dot, but he thought he understood enough to give the solution a try. I'll try. The two strayed away from that topic, but continued to munch on the snacks that his friend provided after some more talk and a couple extra refills of tea. It was time for the boy to leave each time these meetings ended. He was reluctant to go home, but this ending in particular was rough. But like all times, Ishihara handed him some extra cookies and opened the door for Midoriya to leave, and he did. Gripping a backpack strap in one hand and a container of sweets in the other like usual, Gami followed him out, trailing behind a bit. This time though, the teen's mind was elsewhere. Compared to where it usually roamed, he was frozen on the older man's words. He wasn't comfortable letting him know about the spider lilies, but he figured the man's advice would work either way. He was still puzzled about how exactly to apply it to his situation, but he'd figure it out. This was not going to be his breaking point. The next day, Midoriya was not late for school actually. He was 15 minutes early normally. He wouldn't give up his precious sleeping time for anything, but he was hoping to catch the person flowering his desk. He knew it wasn't just one person in particular, but he wasn't sure if his classmates took turns dropping off lilies or one student took charge in buying and placing the flowers. Either way, he had given up some of his free time this morning to try and catch the individual in the act. He hurried into the classroom, but to his dismay, the flowers were already there. Only about half of his class was currently present, not including the teacher of course, so it could only be one of them, but without seeing the person doing it, he could only make assumptions. His classmates still seemed to enjoy watching him react to the spider lilies. The teen figured they would get tired of it after the first few weeks, but it was never-ending entertainment to them, and it wasn't like the teacher made any move to stop them. So until they were reprimanded, he wasn't sure when they would stop. He had tried his best to remain stoic after that initial day with that first flower, looking to Gami for example, but even that didn't deter them. But today, he didn't attempt to go stone-faced at the flowers as he usually did. As for the words, maybe use them as motivation. The boy walked in with a little skip in his step. Not pausing at all at seeing the state of his desk, he didn't even spare a glance at any of the kids in the room. He just acted as he did before in the hall. Motivation. He could feel everyone turn to look at him, clearly not expecting the change in behavior. Even he himself was a bit shocked at his newfound confidence, but he wouldn't let his doubts weigh him down. Well, I'm not saying you have to prove them wrong, but maybe try not to associate their words with negativity. The flowers didn't actually mean anything bad. His class was just trying to get him to associate the lilies with their desires for him to be gone. But it didn't have to be that way. He didn't need to prove them wrong. But that didn't mean he had to give in to their ideas either, which included their outlook on the flowers. So like use their words as a motivator? Ishihara was exactly right. He just needed to view the flowers in a different light, not as a symbol for him to end his life, but maybe as a symbol to start his life, to start living without relying on outside opinions, to feel confident in himself or giving his class the satisfaction of their words getting to him. Exactly, but don't feel compelled to prove them wrong. Maybe the spider lilies represented the death of the old, submissive him, to which a new, confident him rose from the ashes. He agreed with that outlook, and even wanted to cultivate that to him. The flowers symbolized freedom from his past burdens and the start of something new. I'll try. Midoriya got to his desk. His peers still unsure of what to do at his new mojo. He picked up the 3 lilies carefully with one gloved hand, making sure not to decay them, and his glove by accident out of stress, opening up his new leather bag. He put away the flowers as he did every day, before sitting himself down in his seat. The class eventually recovered from their shock at the ringing of the school bell, but just enough to get their work done. The way Gami observed a good majority of them shift nervously around proved to him that their minds were still stuck on his successor. But looking back at the green-haired boy, the spirit could tell he didn't have a care in the world. Midoriya went through the whole day without any problems. Surprisingly, the flowers weighed in the back of his mind as well as his bag. But he kept Ishihara's advice in the foreground. The boy didn't even have to avoid any of his peers cornering him today. They were all too stunned from before. The two were walking down the busy street. Weaving in and out of civilian school had ended without any issues, so the teens' mood was pretty high. They were close to home. But as they got to the door, Midoriya continued past Gami, stopped in bewilderment, but hurried to catch up to his successor. Uizu, we passed the house. He turned to face his ghostly companion. Yeah, I know. The boy gestured for Gami to join him at his side so he didn't have to shout. The specter did, although still confused. I need to pick some stuff up at the convenience store before we go home, if you don't mind. The man nodded in confirmation. No, that is all right. What are you getting? Midoriya giggled. It's a secret. Gami huffed. Will I understand once I see it? Maybe, but I don't think you will. Is that a challenge? If you want it to be, he laughed quietly. Their secretive conversation carried them all the way to the local convenience store, which was only a few blocks down from his house. Midoriya opened the door. Hearing the familiar jingle from the bell attached to it, he held open the door for his invisible friend. But Gami simply shook his head, so he let it go. He had to smother a chuckle at watching the spirit opt to pass through the door instead. The teen walked to the back of the store, ignoring the shop owner's piercing glare. The only reason that the owner hadn't banned the boy from the store yet was because he was a good source of revenue. This convenience store was the only one relatively close to his house, so he came here often, but his frequent business didn't negate the fact that he was societal scum in the shop owner's eyes, so he treaded lightly each visit, including this one. He approached the refrigerated section and opened the glass door. Reaching inside, he grabbed 3 glass bottles of soda pop, then closed said door. Gami looked at him strangely, but Midoriya just eyed him with a smirk. He brought his haul to the counter, where the owner also looked at him weirdly, but nonetheless rang up his 3 drinks. "That'll be 450 yen, the man grumbled. The boy pulled out a few coins from his backpack's side pocket. Since he never felt safe keeping things in his uniform pockets, he was attacked and cornered way too many times for him to feel comfortable keeping anything of value on himself. Besides, this money came from his All Might merch. He didn't want to lose it to one of his classmates. He slid the money onto the counter and flinched as the man greedily snatched it from him. The shop owner shoved the bottles into the teen's arms, and he stumbled to make sure he didn't drop them. "Could I get a bag, please?" he asked. The owner narrowed his eyes, so Midoriya motioned towards his full arms. The man still made no effort to move. "Please, sir," he huffed angrily, but left the comfort of his counter to get a plastic bag from the utilities closet. The closet was way into the back of the store, leaving the counter far out of sight. Midoriya looked around and noticed a camera covering the area right above the register. "Gami," he whispered under his breath, "can you see if you can grab his alleyway key?" The ghost looked at him almost in a shocked manner. "I just need to access the dumpster. I'm not going to do anything stupid." The alleyway right next to the store was always locked by a chain gate. The teen really didn't understand why the owner locked it, since all it held was the store's dumpster. But the gate and fence ran high, with barbed wire at the top, so as easy as it normally would be, there was no way he could scale this fence without getting seriously injured. The Spectre hesitated, unsure of where his successor was going with this, but on hearing the closet door creak shut, he hovered over the counter and grabbed at the key hanging on a drawer knob by the register. He was surprised at the fact he could actually touch it, but didn't waste any more time and hid the item in one of his sleeves. Returning to the teen's side, he held onto the key as the store owner came back with a crumpled plastic bag in his hands. "Here," he heaved snappily, thrusting the bag into the boy's arms, where the bottles also were. Midoriya took a moment to spread his stuff on the counter and shook open the bag. He then placed the 3 glass bottles carefully in before picking the plastic up by its handle. "Thank you, sir," he cheered. "Have a nice day." He swore he heard the man mumble a whatever under his breath, but didn't pay it much mind. He pulled open the entrance door, the bell at the top of the frame ringing again, and walked out. Gami and Toe together, they walked to the alleyway entrance and towards the gate. Midoriya looked around, making sure no bystanders could see him from his spot, before gesturing for the key. "The cameras didn't catch you, right?" He wondered. He knew that the ghost couldn't be caught on film from the times he attempted to take pictures with him, but he was afraid that the cameras might have captured the key moving on its own. "No, I hid the key before I moved it," he replied. Practically reading the boy's mind, the spirit pulled the key out from his sleeve and pressed it into his successor's hand. "I'm surprised you managed to stay solid enough to hold that for so long," the teen pondered. "You feeling any different? Anything stand out?" "Just an overwhelming sense of curiosity for the current situation," Midoriya hummed, but noted that for later. He gripped the key and pushed it into the gate's lock with a small twist. The lock clicked and the gate swung open. He rushed in towards the dumpster, hoping the store owner didn't realize his key was missing just yet. He was prepared to lift open the dumpster lid, only to find it already up. The teen propped himself up on his toes and peered inside, careful not to get anything on his uniform. He scoured through the bin and pulled out each and every glass mason jar he could find. He set them off to the side on the ground and noticed his mentor's puzzled look. "The owner has a tendency to bring in snacks in mason jars while he works. I figured he'd throw them out here when he finished with them." "But why do you need them?" "Well, I can explain that better when we get home." "All right then, I will keep watch." Midoriya stuffed as many jars as he could into the plastic bag with his soda bottles. He wasn't too keen on putting any in his new backpack since they'd just come out of the trash after forcing in his 11th jar. He figured he had enough. "All right, I'm done," he quietly said. Picking up the plastic bag again by its handles, he could hear the glass rattle around, clanking against each other. The boy walked through the open gate, Gami waiting for him on the other side. He closed the gate and locked it shut with a small groan. But instead of taking the key with him, he left it in the lock. "I'm sure when the store owner realizes his key is gone, he'll check the cameras, but since he won't see anyone take it, he'll come out to check the alleyway next," he explained. "He'll just think he left it out here in the lock by accident. No harm, no foul." He exited the alleyway, but not before checking the store entrance to see if anyone was coming. When he confirmed no one was, he left with his true haul, reaching into his plastic bag. He pushed past the jars on top and pulled out one of his soda bottles, putting one of his fingers on the top. He slowly decayed away the metal bottle cap. Once it was completely gone, he brought the bottle up to his mouth and took a sip. "You're getting really good at that." His successor moved the soda away from his face. "What? You mean the whole bottle cap thing?" "Indeed, that was very precise." "Well, I guess my work at Dagaba is really paying off." He shrugged. Gami made a small noise, and Midoriya swore it was a chuckle. He hadn't really noticed how good he was getting with DT. Looking down at the bottle, he realized how exact the decay was. There was no remnant of the metal cap at all, but the actual mouth of the bottle wasn't damaged. He smiled with pride before taking another swig of soda pop. It wasn't long before the duo arrived back home. The boy unlocked the front door and made his way directly into the kitchen. He dropped off his leather bag on the couch, but brought his plastic bag to the sink. He placed the now empty soda bottle on the counter next to him, and the 2 full ones in the fridge, before dumping all the mason jars into the sink. He turned on the water and started rinsing the jars out, hoping to rid them of any grime they may have collected during their time in the dumpster, generously pouring some soap onto the massive jars. He let them soak in the water. The teen grabbed a towel hanging off of the oven handle and brought it over to the sink, popping open the drain. He watched the water whirlpool its way down, eventually leaving the sink empty except for the wet jars. He took each jar and dried it thoroughly before setting it off to the side. After all 11 were completely clean, he placed them on the counter next to his empty bottle. Turning on the water again, Midoriya rinsed out the soda bottle quickly, much less concerned about the cleanliness of that particular one. Once he dried the exterior, he moved the bottle back under the faucet and filled it halfway up. He put it back on the counter next to the mason jars, before doing the same with said jars. "What are you doing?" Gami questioned while watching the boy fill all 11 jars. "You'll see," the boy said in a sing-song tone, then grabbed an armful of jars and brought them to his room. He put them down on his desk before going back for the others, and then his leather bag. After all the containers were placed on his desk, he moved to his desk drawer and pried it open. "So that is where you have been keeping those. The flowers." "Oh yeah, these are the more recent ones, but any from before this week have already wilted." He pulled the flowers out carefully by their stems. Sure, his gloves were on, but he was just being cautious. If he managed to decay through his gloves even slightly, the flowers would disintegrate instantly. The teen then placed 2 or 3 each in a jar, making sure their cut stems reached the water, before moving the bouquets onto his empty bookshelf. Of course, it was the completely empty one, and not the partial one that had his notebooks. He would never take the risk of one of the jars tipping over and ruining his work. He even gave one of today's flowers from his backpack its own container, as the soda bottle's neck was too small to house more than that. Obviously, most of the jars didn't get filled, so Midoriya took those to the bathroom to dump them, before bringing them back and placing them on the shelves. Anyway, his room was still a little bare, but the bright red spider lilies did bring a pop of color. Finally realizing his successor's master plan, the Spectre inquired, "Are you sure about this, Izu?" "What? The flowers?" God, his friend was a bit dense today. "Yeah, I'm sure." He turned back to stare at his work. The flowers almost seemed to sway from a non-existent breeze, like they were waving to him. He couldn't take his eyes off of the elegant shade of red that they were. "I think they look nice." The UA entrance exam approached faster than Midoriya expected, but he didn't feel underprepared. He managed to balance training at Dagaba and his education well enough. In his opinion, Gami did not agree, though his successor was falling asleep way too many times in class for him to call this a win. His mother didn't seem to notice his frequent late nights out of the house. There were times where the teen was so afraid she'd catch him sneaking in after a long day of training, but she was often too drunk to notice. Of course, he wasn't lucky all the time, but he was getting fast enough to make it to his room before she did any serious harm. Unfortunately, the combination of training at Dagaba late into the day, sorting souls into the night, and getting up early to sort as well, it made it difficult to get more than 5 hours of sleep. He didn't want to admit he was having a hard time focusing his thoughts or that he was falling asleep in class, but it was obvious to Gami that the boy was struggling with it all. So the ghost did his best to lift his spirits wherever he could. Midoriya's birthday had passed during the 10 months before the exam. He really didn't find any joy celebrating his birthday, though, since his father was obviously not around and his mother didn't care, so the man had taken it upon himself to make this year's birthday special. For his successor's previous birthdays, the man had usually gotten him notebooks or pencils. Sometimes when stores got overstocked with products, they would leave the extras outside in their alleyways, either to get rid of it or to try and store it sneakily. He would leave the teen sleeping at night to search the alleyways behind these stores, in hopes that he could find something suitable as a gift. It was pretty much all he could do. Since he didn't have any money, it wasn't like he could really hold the cash anyway. And when the spirit did eventually find something he thought the boy would like, he would have to get him to go to the alleyway himself. He couldn't actually grab whatever he wanted to give as much as he tried. His hands just passed right through the item, and though Midoriya constantly reminded him that his efforts were greatly appreciated, Gami never felt like he was doing enough. He cared so much for the teen. And it wasn't just because he was his successor. The Spectre could go on his own rant about how special he thought the boy was. From his endless perseverance, to his selfless personality, to his undeniable skills, Gami would dare say he viewed him as something akin to a son. So that was why he decided to make sure he did something different for his birthday this year. Midoriya had woken up the morning of his birthday as he did every other day. It was a Sunday, so the house was empty. He hadn't differed from his normal schedule, and worked until the sun broke dawn. He noticed that his mentor had been strangely quiet, but didn't comment on it. But as he finally left his room and entered the kitchen, the spirit finally spoke up. "Happy birthday, Izu." "Oh, thank you, Gami." He really wasn't expecting that to be the first word out of the Spectre's mouth. I have something for you," he told the teen, a slight waver in his voice. "It's in the living room. No alleyways this time." He joked sarcastically. "Not this time," he snarked back, which Midoriya noted was unlike him. But he was curious about what the ghost had in store for him, so he left his cereal on the counter and made his way to the couch. As he entered the living room, Gami flew out from behind him and moved to stand behind the coffee table. Instead, the boy giggled at his unusual antics, but continued into the room. He couldn't pick out anything out of the ordinary. There wasn't anything like balloons or cake. Not that he expected that, but he didn't see any notebooks or pencils like he usually got from the spirit. He looked up in confusion, but the ghost just gestured for him to come inside further. That didn't help Midoriya's puzzlement, but he just decided to trust the man. He still didn't see anything, but as he finally walked past the couch, something did lay on the coffee table. "Gami," he started, picking up one of the items. "What is this?" "Unfold it, you will see." And so he did. The item felt soft and fabric-like in his hands. As he shook it open, he saw the sleeves fall out and realized what it was. A black tracksuit jacket unraveled right in front of him. "Well, this is really neat," he gasped out. "Well, there is more." The boy set down the jacket onto the couch and reached for the other folded object on the table. It was also black, but seemed larger than the jacket. He opened it up and the Spectre saw his eyes light up. "Are these matching sweatpants?" he cried in surprise. "Indeed they are," he said with pride. He flipped them around to look at the pants from all angles. The set altogether was pretty cohesive. The jacket had a white stripe running down each sleeve, which connected to the stripe that ran down each leg of the sweatpants. Everything else was a solid, shiny black that felt smooth in his fingers. As he was laying the pants next to the jacket, he noticed that said jacket had a turtleneck that made him really happy, as the burn scar from his father stretched up to the base of his neck and often made him self-conscious. "I noticed that old green tracksuit in your closet. That was what you were planning to wear to the entrance exam, correct?" He didn't wait for a response. "I figured you would rather wear something newer and closer to your current size. I also did not think you would want to wear something so attention-grabbing." Midoriya looked up to flash a wide, bright smile at the man. "You know me so well." "Actually, there is one last thing." "Oh?" "Check in the right pocket of the jacket." The boy moved back to the couch to examine the tracksuit top again. He reached into the right pocket hesitantly, unsure of what to expect. Immediately, his hand met something smooth and fabric-like. It was similar to the feel of the tracksuit, but he noted that whatever this was, it felt thicker and stiffer. Unable to resist his curiosity any longer, he pulled out the item. Now, in his hand, were a pair of black, leather gloves, but it wasn't like the polyester ones he usually wore. These gloves were fingerless. "I know you have not ever been really comfortable with fingerless gloves, but I believe they would be useful to you for the exam." "I'm not really sure. You do not have to wear them the entire time. Just when the practical exam will start, it will be easier for you to use DT without having to rip your other gloves." The teen shuffled the new gloves between his own gloved hand, internally debating Gami's preposition. He didn't see the man also shuffle nervously. "You do have a point." He slowly took off his signature polyester gloves to slip on his new ones. He was careful not to accidentally disintegrate them. As he put them on, he flexed his fingers and turned his hands to inspect them. His silence put the spirit on edge. Maybe the gloves were a bad idea. He really didn't mean to push his successor out of his comfort zone, especially on his birthday of all days. Then, he realized he was being hugged, which completely destroyed any sense of regret he had. He embraced back tightly, knowing Midoriya didn't give hugs often. "Thanks, Gami," he sniffled. "I really don't deserve this." "No, do not say that," the man replied softly. "You deserve so much more. I wish I could give you more." And at that, the boy bursted into tears, loudly sobbing into the spirit's robe. His bare fingers gripped the man's clothing tightly. The ghost panicked, afraid he did something wrong. Even now, after knowing the teen for around 11 years, he still didn't think he was good with kids. Said teen noticed the Spectre's uncertainty and tried to clear up the mess. "I'm sorry," he said, but it was pretty muffled by his face in the robe. "I'm just so happy." He pulled his face out and removed his hands to wipe at his eyes. He glanced up, cheeks red, but smiled the largest smile he could muster. He shook his hands next to his face, showing off his grin and new gloves. Gami seemed to get the message that Midoriya wasn't upset at him. He smiled, though no one could tell, and ruffled the boy's hair. "This was really great," he sighed. "Thank you. It was the least I could do." The two of them simply stood there, content with everything in the moment that was, until the logical side of the teen's brain finally kicked in. "Wait, how did you even get this here?" "I brought it here," the man stated nonchalantly. "Well, obviously, but how did you touch it?" Gami was being uncharacteristically sarcastic today. "I am not too sure," he shrugged. "But it all worked out, did it not?" He huffed. "I guess so." He walked back over to the couch to grab his tracksuit. When he did a double take. "Wait, where did you even get this?" "Not in an alleyway, I can assure you." "You didn't steal this, did you?" He joked. But when the specter didn't respond, Midoriya grew worried. "Gami," he said sternly, "that is a secret." "Gami." The teen whined loudly, a bit unsure of whether his friend was joking back. The two then erupted into laughter and sat together on the couch. The boy would later give away his old and battered green tracksuit to a clothing drive in a nearby neighborhood. He would then have to find the space to hang his new one up. As the older one was folded and tucked away in the corner of a shelf, then he would panic a bit on whether he should wear the set a few times to break it in or leave it pristine for the big day. But that would all happen later. Right now, all Midoriya was worried about was enjoying the high of his birthday. Maybe he would indulge himself today. He had the money to order himself some katsudon. If he didn't feel like cooking on his special day, maybe he wouldn't train today, and instead analyze some quirks mentioned on the news. He could just go out and try to catch a fight if he really wanted to see a quirk in action. It didn't really matter to him what he did today, just as long as he did it with Gami. Finally, the big day came. Midoriya was up way before the sun had risen. He was trying to get in some last-minute training at Dagaba, though it was nothing as strenuous as what he had been doing in the months before. The beach had been completely engulfed in trash when he and Gami saw it the first day, but now, only a few bits remained hidden in the sand. The spirit was left shocked at the sight of the beach restored to how it looked before. The boy would bet that the ghost was about to cry based off the small wavers in his voice, and that would certainly be an oddity. Currently, the two were walking the beach, with the teen kicking around the sand in hopes to find any underlying trash. Any he did find. He would decay with his hand. It would be pointless to use his scythe when the pieces were only the size of his foot and smaller. There actually wasn't much to clean up, so the duo eventually made their way to sitting by the shore, just far enough so that the ocean would only touch their feet. This was the first time Midoriya had gotten the chance to sit by the coastline, but he could tell why the specter liked it so much. He felt calm and serene, and the numerous problems plaguing him each day withered away at the sight of the sparkling sea. If the exam wasn't this day, he wouldn't mind spending his entire day here. "Oh well," the teen started, standing up from the sand. "We'd better get going." "Indeed, are we stopping at the house?" He looked down at himself. Sure, he did have his backpack with his school uniform and his new tracksuit in case he ended up running late, but he still had 3 hours, and if he didn't have to, there was no way he was going to slip his uniform over his sweaty and sandy self. "Yup, I definitely need to shower." And so the two left the comfort of the beautiful and now clean beach park towards their home. The 20-minute walk didn't take long, and the sidewalks were still fairly empty since it was so early. He ran home the entire way, eager to get that last bit of training, and skidding to a stop at his door, he fumbled with his keys before entering. There wasn't anyone inside, but it wasn't like he was expecting anyone. He walked quietly in, completely opposite of how he was moving before. He placed his bag on the couch, careful not to throw it in fear of wrinkling his uniform. Gami didn't fear wrinkles though, and threw himself down onto the sofa. "Hey, careful with my bag," Midoriya chuckled. "I will." He made his way towards the bathroom, eager to wash off all the sand and grime. "I'll be in the shower. Knock if you need anything," the boy teased. He turned around and walked into the bathroom, not getting to see the spirit narrow his eyes at him. Not that he would be able to see it, even if he was looking. Gami listened as the shower turned on. He could hear the water trickling down the tiled wall and then down the drain. It was peaceful to observe, and the ghost didn't mind that his successor forgot to turn on the TV for him. The teen already had so much responsibility. He didn't want to add to that. Sometimes, the specter wished he could do more, but his transparent form limited him on practically everything. He could only interact with Midoriya himself and the couch, to which the boy reassured him was an impressive feat. But he never felt like it was. He could never help with money, nor could he help in fights. He couldn't even carry his bag. For goodness sake, it was demotivating to watch the teen struggle and not be able to do anything. But today was one of the most important days of his successor's life. He wasn't going to sit around and brood. The ghost wasn't sure how, but he would do his best to aid him any way he could today. At the very least, he wouldn't let the boy pick up on his sour mood that would surely spoil his own. And Gami did not want that to happen right before the exam. Suddenly, a voice called through the bathroom door, startling the spirit out of his thoughts. "Hey Gami," the voice was pretty muffled, but that was to be expected since it was coming through the door. "Can you touch my bag?" said Ghost's brows furrowed in confusion, but he swung a free hand at the backpack like he expected. His hand passed right through. No, I cannot." He heard the voice groan. I figured." Then, the bathroom door creaked open, and out came Midoriya. With only a towel wrapped around his waist, his signature green hair was dripping wet, but what was more noticeable was the large scar that spread from the base of his neck down to the middle of his chest, covering the top of his right shoulder as well. Medium-sized cuts ran down his arms, but the spirit knew they were from the bottle shards that occasionally got embedded in his skin. He knew the teen tried to hide his scars, so he averted his eyes quickly in hopes he wasn't making him uncomfortable. The boy was uncomfortable at showing so much of his injuries, but tried not to show it. "I forgot my uniform in my bag." "So you went into the bathroom with no clothes?" He pouted. "I had my boxers." The specter huffed jokingly. "Whatever you say." He grumbled and snatched his backpack, then rushed off to his bedroom. Gami smirked, feeling like he had thoroughly gotten his revenge for the comment earlier. The man looked up at the clock. Midoriya's shower hadn't lasted as long as he thought it did. As long as the teen didn't take too long getting ready, they would be able to arrive at UA with ample time to spare. As if he had read the ghost's mind, the boy emerged from his room fully dressed in his school's uniform. He had his backpack strung over his shoulders and was currently putting on his usual polyester gloves. "I've got my tracksuit and my other gloves," he cheered. "Let's get going." "All right then," he replied and lifted himself off the couch. The duo left the house eagerly, with Midoriya quickly locking the front door. He then shoved his house keys into his backpack and started towards the subway. Gami close behind. He gripped his bag straps confidently. A small smile adorned his face. Today was his big day, and nothing was going to stop him. 1 40-minute subway ride later, the two had arrived at the front entrance of UA High School. The school was large and grand. The sunlight that bounced off its numerous windows could be mistaken for the building simply shining on its own. Bare trees lined the walkway, and Midoriya was excited to see how they would frame it once they grew leaves again. He was a bit nervous, but that was to be expected. He knew as long as he took steps forward, no matter how slow or timid they were, he would make it through that door. Besides, the boy knew he wasn't alone with Gami simply walking beside him. He knew he could take on anything this exam threw at him. "Get out of my way or you're dead." The teen instinctively flinched away from that voice. He didn't even need to look to confirm who it was. Bakugo walked past him, seemingly annoyed. He wore a moderate coat and a beige scarf over his uniform. Midoriya stared, a bit jealous towards the blonde. The set of winter accessories looked warm and cozy, and much more protective than simply the school uniform like the shy teen was wearing. He didn't respond to Bakugo, though this was the first time he'd spoken to him since the sludge villain incident. Actually, the angry teen hadn't tormented him since the villain attack either. Not that he or Gami hadn't noticed. Both were very observant and picked up on the strange behavior, but just took it as a blessing in disguise. The kids around them noticed the blonde as well, and started whispering. Bakugo was infamous for that whole mess with the sludge villain. His face was known throughout practically the whole country, but the boy wasn't jealous over that. He was glad he wasn't the center of attention. That would make him simply more nervous. "Well, Izu," the ghost began, "do not let him bother you. Let's get inside." He hummed, careful not to seem as if he was talking to himself. But Gami still picked up on his successor's shaky confidence, so he kept his pep talk going. "Keep these past 10 months fresh in your mind. You are an entirely new person, and this is your first step to becoming a hero." He nodded sharply, looking up at his mentor. "This is your time to shine and move forward." "Yeah," he whispered strongly, trying his best to keep his voice under his breath. The ghost was right. This was his first step as well as important one, and he knew he had the skills to have a chance. Staring at the specter, he flashed a small, unassuming smile to show the man he was feeling good, and then proceeded to trip over his own feet in distraction. He could hear Gami yell his name in concern, but he was about to fall on his face. What a great way to start the day. But he never met the ground. Instead, he floated a few inches above it. He could definitely admit he was surprised, but he didn't squirm around or anything. He turned his head to see a pretty-looking brunette wearing a burgundy coat. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. "Oh, why, yeah," he stammered back. The girl smiled before helping him back upright. Once he was, Midoriya felt himself stop floating and land softly onto the walkway again. He was still in a state of semi-shock, and didn't realize he had been touched on the arm, right under his scar. "It's my quirk," she continued. "Sorry for stopping you, but it's a bad omen to trip and fall." "Oh well, thank you," the teen replied shakily. "This sure is nerve-wracking," she chuckled, breathing out a puff of frozen air. "Why yeah, for sure." The brunette then started to walk away, but as she did, she looked back and waved. "Good luck to the both of us." Midoriya went to reply back, but by the time he willed up the confidence, she was gone. He wasn't really sure what just happened. All he really figured out was that he just had a nice conversation with another kid his age that was definitely a first. Izu, we should get going, his mentor finally said, snapping him out of his head. Ah yeah, right. He stuttered out. A lot of the other kids around him were now eyeing him in sneaking glances. They were probably sizing him up and deeming him not a threat. The boy's fingers shook as he scampered up the steps and into the school, his confidence faltering a bit. He hated being the center of attention. The teen walked into the large lecture hall, albeit a bit later than he wanted to. He shuffled to find his seat, which was unfortunately next to Bakugo. He sat nervously and waited for the briefing to start. Gami must have noticed his shuffling, because the man placed his hand on his left shoulder. Avoiding the one with the scar, he brought his hand up to grip the spirit's extended sleeve, making it look like he was grabbing his uniform instead. Welcome to today's live performance. The shout nearly made Midoriya yelp in surprise. Everybody say hey. There was no way he was going to yell back. Even if it was present Mike, he was eager to draw as little attention to his form as possible. He noticed that everyone else in the hall felt the same way, even if it wasn't for the same reason. The pro faltered a bit under the heavy silence, but immediately followed that up with more excitement. Well, that's cool, my examinee listeners. The hero continued. I'm here to present the guidelines of your practical. Are you ready? Again, he was met with pure silence, so he answered his own call with a loud yeah. Izu, the ghost's low monotone voice startled the boy a bit. Who is this loud, obnoxious man? That's the voice hero, present Mike, he explained softly. He's got an offensively powerful voice-activated quirk, plus his own radio show and everything. Shut up, nerd. Bakugo groaned. The teen wasn't expecting him to talk, but he did follow his directions. This is how the test will go, listeners. You'll be experiencing 10-minute-long mock sit escape maneuvers. Present Mike resumed. Bring along whatever you want. After this presentation, you'll each head to your assigned testing location. At that, there were murmurs in the crowd. Midoriya and Gami both listened in. That's so kids from the same middle school can't help each other out. And why consecutive ID numbers are assigned to different locations. Midoriya checked out his exam card after glancing at Bakugo's next to him. He confirmed the whispers. His ID number was only one lower than the blonde, but they weren't assigned same exam location. That made him release a sigh of relief. He definitely wouldn't be comfortable while knowing the angry teen could come out from any corner and attack him. After letting the students in the hall talk for a bit, the hero got back on track. Each side is filled with 3 kinds of faux villains. Points are awarded for defeating each according to their own respective difficulty levels. So they would be fighting faux villains. That made the boy feel much better about his chances. The villains would likely be dummies or robots, and neither felt any pain. He would be able to use DT without too much guilt then. Use your quirks to disable these faux villains and earn points. That's your goal, listeners. You are looking very confident, Izu. The teen let out a happy huff, quietly confirming the man's statement. Of course, attacking other examinees is prohibited. That's not very hero-like. Suddenly, a student stood up from his seat. Both he and the ghost moved to look at him. The kid was tall, with very broad shoulders and a broad stance to match. He had neatly combed bluish-black hair and what looked to be a pair of square-framed glasses, but he couldn't really tell as he was facing away. May I ask a question? The student exclaimed loudly, raising his hand stiffly into the air. He continued without any confirmation from the hero. There appear to be no fewer than 4 varieties of faux villains on this handout. Such a blatant error is highly unbecoming for UA. We are all here today in hopes of being molded into model heroes. Midoriya had noticed the same thing, but he assumed that present Mike would explain it later. I guess he would have to explain it now then. And you, with the curly hair. The bold teen was now pointing at him. He jolted from the sudden call and began to wither under the stares of everyone else in the hall. You've been muttering this whole time. It's distracting. If this is some sort of game to you, then leave immediately. At that, the timid teen sank down into his chair. There were many giggles and glares, all of which were directed at him. Gami growled aggressively, fed up with rude children at this point. All right. The pro finally broke the tension. Examinee 7111, nice catch, but the 4th faux villain gets you 0 points. He's more of an obstacle than anything. Present Mike waved his hands around, trying to emphasize his point. There's only one at each side. A gimmick that will rampage around in close quarters. Thank you, sir. I apologize for the interruption. The blunt kid bowed, then sat back down. Well, that's all from me. I'll leave you listeners with our school motto. Midoriya gripped his exam card with hesitation. His confidence was sorely shaken from all that had happened. And the exam hadn't even started yet. Plus ultra. Break a leg, everyone. Whoa, Midoriya gasped out at the sight of the faux city. It was so amazing how UA had a bunch of these on campus. The teen looked around in awe. Even his fellow examinees amazed him. Everyone here looks so confident. He whispered to the spirit standing next to him. They've even got equipment to match their quirks. That may be true, the man replied, but do not forget about yourself. You are just as impressive. I don't know. He tugged on his new tracksuit. He couldn't lie. He felt good in his black jacket and pants. He had switched out his usual polyester gloves for his new fingerless, leather ones. He was a bit nervous wearing them, but he knew they would be better for the exam than the ones he felt comfortable wearing at first. He thought he looked too monochrome when he tried on the tracksuit, so he made sure to wear his signature red sneakers to fully complete the outfit. Looking around, he spotted the nice girl who had helped him before the briefing. She had her eyes closed and was moving her hands rhythmically. "Oh look, Gami," he mumbled. "It's her. She looks kinda nervous though." "Indeed. Maybe I should see if I can boost her spirits since she helped me out earlier." "That sounds like a good idea," as well as a friendly gesture. Midoriya took some slow steps towards the brunette, but was completely halted in his tracks by a firm grab to his right shoulder. "What are you doing?" Hoping to interfere, the duo recognized it as the same student who had called out the boy before. Gami noticed his successor's breath turn raspy. The child was still tightly holding the shoulder with the scar. He could see the boy's hands shaking. Murmurs grew from the crowd as they once did in the lecture hall. Each one made the reserved teen doubt himself more. That kid was acting like an idiot at the front gate. He flinches at the slightest touch. I guess that's one less rival to worry about. Midoriya went to swat away the hand, but then he realized he didn't have his usual gloves on. As much as this kid made him uncomfortable, he wouldn't put him at risk if he couldn't control his power, so he mustered up all the leftover courage he had. "Get your hand off me," he spoke bitterly. "Wait, bitterness? This wasn't him. Where was this coming from? Before we have a problem." "What?" The kid scoffed, but removed his hand. "That isn't like a hero at all." But the teen didn't care. He was done being pushed around today. He felt an unnatural rage pulling in his gut, and he was a bit afraid of it. He wasn't a very angry person, and he really didn't want to become one, so he took a deep breath in and focused his thoughts anywhere else, as long as they weren't on the kids around him. "That was unlike you, Izu." "Boy, do I know." Suddenly, Present Mike's voice echoed over the plaza. "And begin." To the boy, it felt like a switch flipped. He could hear the groans of the gates being opened, but didn't even hesitate. He ran through the crowd of examinees and was the first to enter the faux city. "The test has started," the hero yelled to the rest of the crowd. "That kid's got the right idea." All the other examinees then took off, pushing past each other to try and get a head start, but none could catch up to the boy. They were just mocking Gami, who stayed behind with the other kids, rushed to catch up with his successor. Midoriya was definitely not as confident as he was when he first walked into UAS front gate, but he would make do sprinting down a fake street. He could hear a sudden crack to the building next to him. Then a huge robot bursted through the wall of one of the faux buildings. He could read a bold, white one on one of its appendages. "It's a one-pointer. They're quick, but fragile," he remembered from the handout back at the briefing. But he didn't flinch as most would expect him to. Instead, he flexed his hand and summoned his weapon. The robot charged him. Target locked. Prepare for termination. He gripped his scythe with both hands, lifting it up over his head. He poured his whole body as well as DT into the swing. The blade cut cleanly into the robot. But that wasn't what did the most damage to the villain. As he sliced, DT instantaneously spread throughout the entire bot and it crumbled into pieces, metal chunks shattering everywhere. "That's 1 point for me," he exclaimed proudly, making his weapon disappear. "Great job, Izu." The teen turned around in surprise. He hadn't noticed that Gami wasn't with him, but he didn't have any time to spare. Rushing out of the wrecked area, he went on search for more villains. "Down here, there are 2, the ghost called out. He responded immediately. Racing down towards his mentor's voice, he turned down a seemingly empty alleyway, only to watch the specter point up. He looked up in confusion, only to jump back as a 1-pointer and a 2-pointer fell from above him. He didn't have time to summon his weapon, nor the room to swing it, but he still didn't hesitate, almost acting on instinct. He swiped one of his hands out to graze the 1-pointer, but as it did, the robot cracked and fell to the ground in pieces. The 2-pointer's large scorpion tail lunged at his form, but he leaped out of the way, then countering with a strike using his other hand. The robot decayed just as the others had. 4 points. He cried to no one in particular. "Gami, can you keep searching for robots?" "I shall do my best." "Great. Then let's go." The two continued their team strategy, with the spirit acting as an intelligence gatherer and Midoriya swooping in to get a quick kill. They worked extremely well, as Gami's spiritual form allowed him to pass through rubble and buildings to find bots or map out paths, and while he would never admit it to his successor, his fears from earlier were quelled. The man was worried that he wouldn't be able to do much for the boy during his exam, but those thoughts diminished slowly after each robot he discovered. The teen largely favored his scythe when dismantling the faux villains, still unsure of his new gloves. But if a situation arose similar to the alleyway before, he acted completely on instinct. Unafraid to use his deadly touch, he was quick on his feet too, not pausing for a moment after he scored a point. Unfortunately, he had a few points stolen from him, but even then, he'd racked up a decent 26 points. 6 minutes, 2 seconds remaining. He could hear from a speaker somewhere. He now found himself in the center of the mock city, surrounded by robot carcasses. There were other examinees around him as well, but no active villains to fight. I cannot find any more enemies. He could hear the other kids calling out their points, and as each score was said and higher than his own, his confidence faltered. This wasn't good. Unsure of what to do, he looked around at the kids in the area. If the situation were different, he'd love to examine their quirks. Then, he felt the entire ground shake violently. He, as well as the other examinees, searched around for what could be causing it. That's when all hell broke loose. Midoriya immediately recognized it as the zero-pointer present Mike mentioned back in the briefing. It tore through the tops of buildings with ease as it plowed its own route down the street. Debris fell everywhere as all the students rushed to escape. Its wrath, he could make out the kid that had embarrassed him earlier as one of the first to get away. With surprising speed, the teen figured he must have some sort of speed quirk. Izu, let us get going. Gami called out over the chaos. This looks dangerous. I guess that's true. Hopefully we can find some more points before the exam ends. So he did his best not to get trampled by the crowd as he evacuated, weaving around fallen, as well as falling debris was challenging, but similar to the sludge villain fight in the alleyway. So he didn't have as much trouble as he expected. He turned one last time, just to view the destruction of the massive obstacle. His eyes widened in shock, and not from said destruction. The nice brunette, who had made sure he didn't fall on his way into the lecture hall, who he had his first pleasant student conversation with, who had wished him luck on the exam, was lying helpless on the broken pavement. He turned around completely now, ignoring his mentor's comments on how he should keep moving. The zero-pointer was plowing towards her, with no intention of stopping. He froze, internally debating what he should do. He hadn't had a premonition about her, so surely she wasn't going to die, right? The UA staff would surely stop the robot before it reached her, right? But what if they didn't? Was this her time to go? That thought sickened him. It's a bad omen to trip and fall. That killed any conflict he had. He rushed towards her prone form. She struggled to look up at him. He noticed her left foot was caught under a pile of rubble from the villain's rampage. Don't move, Midoriya reassured her. I'll get you out. She didn't answer, but he could see it in her face. He wouldn't fail the first person his age that had been nice to him. He slammed both hands onto the pile of debris and instantly, all of the rubble decayed away, turning to mere dust. He didn't have the time to look at her reaction. But if he did, he would see complete shock and awe plastered on it. He took a glance at her recently trapped ankle and winced. Can you walk? He knew she couldn't, but figured he'd ask anyway. And no. All right then, I'm going to carry you. The teen moved quickly to her side and slid his arms under her limp body with a huff. He mustered up more of his strength to lift her up. She wasn't particularly heavy, but he has also never carried a person before. He cradled her in his arms and took steady, but fast steps away from the zero-pointer. You can set her down here. Gami pointed towards a building away from the giant robot. This building is still structurally sound. Midoriya didn't respond, but rushed over to the building that the spirit picked out. He set her down against the wall of the building. She immediately cradled her injured foot, but looked up at him. Thank you, the brunette whimpered. He nodded, but lurched his attention back to the zero-pointer. At a loud crash, he watched it ram into another building, bringing it down without a sweat. This is bad, he said aloud. Someone is going to get seriously hurt if that thing isn't stopped. 2 minutes remaining. He flinched at that. 2 minutes. That's it. That wouldn't be enough time to find any more robots. That wasn't enough time to get the points he needed to pass the exam. But it was enough time to stop the rampaging robot. He rushed away from the girl who he had just helped, ignoring the specter's cries for him not to. He couldn't just disintegrate the bot from one of its feet with the way it hunched over. If he did, the bot would come crashing to the ground faster than he could decay it. That would only put more people in danger. He would have to start from the top. Reaching the zero-pointer massive, moving foot, he made a split-second decision that would nearly give Gami a heart attack, despite not having a physical heart. The boy hastily summoned his scythe and poured a small amount of DT into it. Then he slammed as high as he could into the robot's foot. Of course, the bot didn't even flinch, but that wasn't his plan. He tugged on his weapon, and once he was sure it wouldn't come out, he stopped the flow of DT, effectively ending the decay using only his upper body strength he had gained from swinging the thing around at Dagaba. He began pulling himself up the handle of his weapon. What is he doing? The girl cried from her spot by the building. The ghost standing next to her couldn't agree more. Once Midoriya reached the end of his scythe's handle, he removed one of his hands. He made a mental note to thank his mentor later for the fingerless gloves as he raised a hand above his head and grabbed as high as he could again, only using a small amount of DT. He decayed the space where his hand was, just enough to make an indentation that he could grip. He removed his other hand, the one still holding onto the handle, and did the same thing in the moment. He relied solely on his upper body strength, as he didn't have a place for his feet to rest yet. He continued the rhythm, effectively scaling the zero-pointer like a rock climber. His feet eventually found placement in the holes he had first decayed for his hands working fast and furiously. He climbed up the leg and back of the robot. With the injured brunette and his mentor watching on in astonishment, he reached the right shoulder of the bot and hoisted himself onto it, stabling his form on all fours. But even now, just disintegrating the zero-pointer's head wouldn't be enough to make it fall backwards as he needed it to. I need to get in front of it. And so, with who knows how much time left to spare, he scampered down the robot's right arm, remaining on all fours so as to not fall off. The bot still didn't notice him, maybe considering him too small of a threat to really care about, but that worked in Midoriya's favor, as he had no trouble reaching the end of the metal arm. Looking up at the robot's rectangular face, he formulated a plan. The teen flexed his hand again, gripping the familiar feeling of his weapon's handle in both hands. He then made another decision that would make the ghost keel over, even though he again technically couldn't. He leaped off the arm of the zero-pointer, but turned his body so he was facing it head-on in the air, lifting his scythe as above his head as he possibly could. He channeled every single ounce of DT he had and more, and shared it with his weapon. I need to hit this thing with everything I've got. Then, the backlash of my swing should make it fall backwards. With every bit of strength and DT he had, he slashed the blade directly at the robot's head. The swing ripped through the air with force Midoriya had never used before, but it wasn't close enough to hit the villain's head. No, he began to fall, thinking he had failed, that all his efforts were for nothing. But a loud explosion made him look up. His swing, while it only cut air, had so much DT pouring through it that it disintegrated every single molecule it had passed through. The absence of anything in that strike created an unstable vacuum, and as the molecules around it rushed to fill the void, the sheer instability generated an enormous shockwave that struck the zero-pointer head-on. The teen watched as the gigantic robot's face was decimated by the blow. It fell completely backwards from the swing and crashed into the area it had destroyed before. Injuring no more examinees, he knew there was no way it would be able to get up after that. Everyone in the mock city turned to watch the zero-pointer collapse and gasped in pure shock. Some had gotten to watch the show in action, but many were left wondering who took down that massive of an obstacle. Unfortunately, there was one part of his master plan that went unaccounted for, that being his descent. He hadn't thought about how he would get down once he jumped off the robot. But as he was currently falling, the boy couldn't think of any way he could save himself. Sure, he wouldn't die, of course, but his modified quirk records didn't mention his immortality at all. Once he eventually recovered from being a pile of mush, he would have to explain himself, and that would obviously cause a lot of problems. As he came closer and closer to the ground, he truly realized there was nothing he could do if he even tried to do a similar strike at the ground. The shockwave would likely injure many examinees. He would just have to splatter and come up with a story later. Suddenly, he was slapped in the face. His end wasn't as painful as he expected, but he wasn't complaining. But then he noticed he was floating above the ground, just inches from falling face flat. He instantly knew what was going on. It was the girl's quirk again. He looked up at her and watched as she floated on a chunk of a robot. She looked to be struggling and in pain. Midoriya felt the guilt pool in his stomach. He didn't mean for her to get hurt more, especially trying to save him. Release, she stammered out quietly, but just loud enough for him to hear. He then dropped to the ground roughly, and the robot that the brunette was on fell right beside him. He got to his feet as quickly as he could and rushed over to her. Watch out, she cried, waving one hand in front of her face. He stopped in his tracks at her warning and stepped back as she proceeded to barf right at the spot he previously was at. When she finished, he stumbled over to the side of the robot piece she was still laying on. Are you all right? He asked. Here, let me help you down. She gratefully took his outstretched hand and pulled herself up so that she was sitting. The teen then motioned for her to jump down, opening his arms to gesture that he would catch her. The girl hesitated, but slid herself off the rubble, and as he had gestured, he did catch her, making sure her injured foot didn't hit the ground. I'm going to set you down, is that okay? She nodded. So Midoriya set her down against the robot piece she had been floating on, just like he had done originally with the building. And it's over. The boy finally let out the breath he had been holding since the beginning of the exam, and let his shoulders slump. He was sure he hadn't passed the exam, but he had taken down the zero-pointer single-handedly. That was enough for him to feel semi-prideful. The examinees had now congregated around him and the girl, whispers and murmurs traveling through the crowd, but Midoriya didn't care at that moment. He just wanted to make sure the brunette was okay before he left. The crowd then cleared as a small, old lady made her way through, using a giant syringe as a cane. He turned to look at the woman, immediately recognizing who it was. Recovery girl, the teen called out. Oh, the heroine responded. She has an injury to her left foot, he stated, motioning to the sitting girl. Well, all right then. The older woman moved to give the girl a kiss on her head almost instantaneously. Her injured foot was completely healed, as if she never had the injury to begin with. Are you hurt anywhere, dearie? She now asked him. No. Nonsense. Here, take these gummies. She then shoved a handful of gummy bears into his hand. He stumbled to catch them, but a good majority of them decayed at his fingertips. She looked up at him in confusion. Sorry, he apologized. That happens when I'm stressed. Oh, that's all right. Do you want any more? No, this is fine. He shoved the remaining gummies into his mouth. She laughed at his antics. All right then, dearie. Have a nice day. Midoriya moved to walk out with the rest of the examinees, but not before turning back to smile at the brunette. She smiled back at him, but before she could call out for him to stop, he was gone. Midoriya was confident he didn't pass. He knew that he'd scored well enough on the written portion of the exam. But with only 26 points, there was no way he passed the practical portion. In the week after the exam, Gami did his best to lift the boy's mood. Sure, he did drill into him the day after the exam, making sure his successor would be more self-preserving in the future, but he was proud of him and of his success with his abilities. The shockwave from his scythe was proof enough that his training had paid off. But that week, there wasn't much the man could do to make him feel better about his performance. He was sorely convinced that he'd blown the only shot he had at UA. His mother obviously hadn't noticed her son's change in behavior, and neither had his classmates. Ishihara would have probably noticed. But he hadn't gone to see the man since the entrance exam. He didn't want to disappoint the only other person that had believed in him. It was around midday, and Midoriya was writing in one of his notebooks with the news playing in the background. The Spectre had gotten up at some point and hadn't joined him back on the couch. The man had probably left for the day, and he couldn't blame him. Who would want to hang out with such a failure like him? Izuku. He turned to face the call in confusion. He thought that Gami had left. The letter. It's outside. At that, he stumbled off of the couch and raced out the front door just as the spirit said. The letter from UA was inside his mailbox. He grabbed the envelope and rushed back inside. With the ghost right behind him, they both plopped themselves onto the sofa. But staring at the letter in his hands, the teen suddenly lost all excitement to open it. He was lucky to have his normal polyester gloves on, or the envelope would have probably disintegrated out of stress. The man sitting next to him noticed his successor's hesitance and tried to ease him into opening the letter. Izuku, we both know how great you are, and if UA cannot see that, then we will find another way for you to become a hero. The boy sighed. I guess you're right. He carefully ripped open the top and slid the contents out onto the coffee table. Out came a piece of paper and a metallic disc. As the disc hit the table, it seemed to turn on. Both Midoriya and Gami flinched away from the bright screen that seemed to emerge from the device. This is a projection. And that was the last voice he wanted to hear today. He could hear the ghost next to him groan. He almost did the same. Young Midoriya, I am here to discuss your exam results. I wonder why All Might is speaking on behalf of UA. Midoriya was wondering the exact same thing. You did pass the written exam with flying colors. He pretty much knew that already, but it was nice to have the confirmation. But with only 26 points on the practical, it naturally results in failure. He looked down, not wanting to hear any more. His lip quivered and he could feel the tears threatening to fall. He knew he failed already. But that's not the end of the story. What? Please, watch the screen. He looked up from his lap at the screen to see the brunette from the exam, looking worried. Excuse me, but he heard her say to present Mike, that curly-haired boy with freckles. If it wasn't for the scythe he had, he'd look pretty plain. He watched the pro hero nod. Can you give him some of the points I earned? What? Midoriya gasped in shock. He used up the last minutes of the exam to save me. But he could have gotten so many more points instead. Can you at least give him however many points he passed up trying to save me? Both he and Gami turned to look at each other. That boy, he saved my life. The screen paused, and the duo could hear All Might's voice return. You see, he started, in this exam, we weren't just watching for villain-based points. The video then kept going and Present Mike moved to respond to the girl. I'm afraid we can't give him your points, but there shouldn't be a need for it, my little listener. Then the video stopped again, for what the teen assumed to be the last time, as All Might's face reappeared on the screen. A hero course that rejects those who do the right thing is no hero course at all. Now the two were intrigued. Where was the hero going with this? Rescue points were also a factor, another way for UA to evaluate you. Rescue points, like points for saving people. 60 points for Izuku Midoriya, he announced, making the boy fall back into the couch. And while we're at it, 45 points for Ochako Uraraka. That was enough for the boy to let the waterworks fall, but for an entirely different reason than why he was going to before. Though I'm not sure how All Might huffed under his breath, though both individuals caught it. He then thrusted his hand towards the screen. They're in. The projection stopped after that. But Midoriya's tears didn't. Gami wasn't too sure what to do, so he rubbed his hand onto his successor's back, hoping to calm him down. I did it, he whimpered out. I passed. I am so proud of you. I knew you could do it. He jumped to embrace his mentor tightly. The ghost wasn't expecting it, but happily hugged back. He could feel the waves of happiness rolling off the boy. Even as he was crying, they remained like that for a while, until the spirit suggested an idea. You have not visited Ishihara since the exam. Why don't you go tell him the good news? Oh, that would be great, he exclaimed. He would be so proud. The teen stood up and grabbed the paper that had come with the projection device. He didn't even get his backpack or his coat and flew out the front door, just stopping to grab his keys. He shut the door roughly before running down the sidewalk in the direction of that beautiful blue house. And just like that, Midoriya's mood was ruined. Dashed. Devastated, he was watching the news right before he had gotten his letter. There should have been no way he could miss a story as big as this. Ishihara's quaint blue house was partially crushed by a huge chunk of a building. The entire street was blocked off by police and surrounded by civilians looking up. The boy realized that an office building the next street over was missing the exact piece that was currently crushing his friend's home. He frantically shoved his way through the crowd and approached the nearest officer. "Sir, what happened?" The officer turned to look at him, immediately recognizing who he was. "Oh, is you, from the sludge villain incident 10 months back. Look, kid, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You can't really be trusted to be this close to the scene." "Please, sir, I know the man who lives here." He nearly broke down into tears again. "Please, I need to know." The man sighed in exasperation. "I can't say much, but there was a pretty nasty villain attack here. His quirk hit that building over there during an altercation with some heroes and it fell on the house." "Was there anyone in the house at the time?" The officer's shoulders slumped in annoyance. "Yeah, there was a man. He sustained pretty severe injuries and was in critical condition when he was rushed to the hospital." Midoriya's hand shot up to his mouth. Afraid he was going to throw up, he backed out of the crowd and stumbled on the sidewalk towards him home, nearly dropping the letter from UA in the process. "Izu, I am sure he will be all right." But the teen didn't listen. He just wanted to get home back, or see Ishihara all right. He hadn't spoken to him since before the exam. He actively refused to visit him in the week after he finished the exam, solely because he was afraid of disappointing him. There was no way he could live with himself if something happened to him. The two arrived back home, and Midoriya went right to the TV to turn on the news channel. He sat in front of the TV for the rest of the night until his mother came home, forcing him to evacuate. He didn't even eat any dinner, as much as Gami pushed him to do so. He spent every single second trying to piece together what had happened to the man he had grown to care for so much. The officer wasn't wrong. There was a villain attack in that area. But it didn't start out that close to the blue house. The heroes had pushed the villain by accident into the suburban area, away from the city where it started. The villain had some sort of finger missile quirk, which allowed him to shoot his fingers off his hands like rockets, and then regrow them instantly. Whatever they hit, they did serious damage to. Apparently, one of the villain's fingers strayed away from its target and hit that office building instead, causing a good-sized chunk of it to fall down, and it fell right on Ishihara's house. The man was in the house at the time, and like the officer said, was severely injured. The ambulance didn't arrive until almost 10 minutes later, after the villain was restrained. That's why his friend was in such critical condition. He had remained trapped and injured in his own home for nearly 10 minutes. That thought made Midoriya sick, but what made him sicker was the fact that there weren't any updates on his condition. He had no idea how the man was doing. His mother eventually came home, so he moved into his room and turned off the TV. Now, he sat at his desk. He was sketching in one of his notebooks before, but he couldn't will himself to do that anymore. He had sat completely still in the chair for a good while, unsure of what to really do, but eventually settled on doing his job that needed to get done anyway. He wasn't sure how long he had been working with the little puffs of light based on his mentor's begs for him to sleep. He was sure it had at least been 2 hours, but the boy didn't want to sleep. He simply felt too sick to shut his eyes. His head had been phasing in and out after each soul he sent away, not really paying too much attention to their names or their lives. "Izu, please, I understand you are hurting, but you need to sleep. It is nearly 1 in the morning. 2 can't sleep. I don't want to sleep knowing everything that's happened today, but you have to at least try." I'll go to sleep in a little bit," he compromised, "just not now." Gami sighed, but took the little leeway he had been given. He moved next to his successor and ruffled his hair. "Fine, but do not make it too long." Midoriya nodded shakily and reached for another little orb as it came to him. He could feel the warmth coming off of it. It felt sort of comforting, and he appreciated that in the moment. But as he touched it and the information came flooding to his head, he choked and fell to the floor on his knees. No, he stammered, dropping the soul to clutch his mouth. "Izu, what is it? What is wrong?" "No," he wailed and hunched over. Gami immediately got the message, but he wasn't sure how to help the distraught boy on the floor. Distraught wasn't even the right word for him at the moment. He was torn, broken, destroyed. The Spectre was worried that the teen's mother might wake up because of the noise, but he couldn't lock the door, so he simply hoped that she was too drunk to even open her eyes. I never got to. He jumbled up his sentences to the point where the man was having a hard time figuring out what he was saying. He attempted to get closer to his successor when he let out another BLD curling wail. "I quote, I'm sorry." The noise in the room slowly diminished into pained gasps and sobs. Midoriya still didn't move from his spot on the floor. The small soul he had let go of was now floating right in front of his drooped head. The puff didn't move from its spot. The room stayed silent other than the cries, but neither person made a move to change that, not for a long time. "Anyway, I can't," he finally stuttered out. "Izuku, I can't do it." The ghost took that as his cue to move in with the embrace. He knew exactly what Midoriya was experiencing right now. There had been a time where he himself had come face to face with his own loved ones while doing his job. It was painful, to say the very least, but he did realize that no matter where they were when they passed, or who they were with, he always got the last goodbye. I know it hurts right now," he started, hoping to calm the boy enough to at least hold the orb again, "but you have the chance to show him before he has to go." The teen's lips shook uncontrollably and ugly. Fat tears streamed down his cheeks, but he still managed to look up at Gami. "See, can he hear me?" The spirit's gaze moved away. Not that the boy could tell. "I do not know, but you can still tell him." The boy wasn't sure if he liked that answer, but he managed to get his shaking under control long enough to cup the soul again. He felt the warmth spread throughout his body again. Like he was under the morning sun, the ball of light seemed to shine brighter in his hands. But he couldn't tell if that just was from the glint of his tears. "Well, I've got full faith that you'll turn out to be someone great, and if you're planning on going into heroics, then I'll just have to keep an ear out for you." He moved the light close to his chest. "I meant what I said when we first met, quirk or not. You are going to be a great hero one day, Midoriya." His tears fell from his face and onto his cupped hands, going right through the orb. "Well, I'm not saying you have to prove them wrong, but maybe try not to associate their words with negativity." Gami watched as the boy struggled with what he wanted to say. He knew from personal experience this was really difficult, but as much as he wanted to comfort him, he knew this wasn't the right time to do so. This was Midoriya's moment, and he wasn't going to intrude. Said teen continued to sob, but it was much quieter than before. He felt like an absolute hurricane, as well as an awful person. He wished he could go back in time just to visit him again before today. The guilt that was eating at him wasn't pulling any punches. He wanted to make it up to the man. He wanted to make up for the fact that he hadn't come to visit like he should have, but he didn't know what words to use. What words could ever make up for what he had done, or more accurately, what he didn't do? He turned his head away and looked towards his desk at random. Even from the floor, he could see the letter from UA as well as the holographic disc that had announced to him the good news. What a roller coaster of a day it had been, and what he wouldn't give to make it less disastrous. He looked back at the soul in his hands. He almost thought it was staring back at him from the way it glittered. "Just make sure to remember your biggest fan when you go pro, Ishihara-sen," he began again. The light glowed in response, but Midoriya swore it was just his head messing with him. "I did it. I'm going to UA." It didn't take long for spring to arrive, as well as the start of UA, but it sure felt like a while to Midoriya. It had only been a couple months after the entrance exam, but so much had gone down. There was never a dull moment, but every moment felt dull. It was hard for the boy to explain, but Gami seemed to understand it just fine. Ishihara's death had hit him hard. He sometimes found himself walking to the Blue House in hopes he could be let inside, only to meet the police tape that surrounded the property. He heard the family had already had the funeral, and as much as he knew he wouldn't get an invitation, it still left him awfully depressed. All he really had were the few plates the man had given to him for taking cookies home. Those ceramic plates stayed on the bottom shelf of the bookcase with his flowers. He would never risk them falling and breaking. But currently, the teen wasn't in the comfort of his room with his flowers and his plates. No, right now, he was in the principal's office at Aldera. His day at school had been as it usually was, except for the teacher telling him that the principal wanted to see him and Bakugo after class. He wasn't sure what the man wanted with him at first, but now he had made it obvious. "How wonderful that 2 of our students have made it into UA." The plump man stated. The comment would have been nice if it weren't for the subtle messages he knew the man was pushing. Midoriya opted to stand still towards the back of the office. His gloved hands picked at his uniform pants. He desperately wanted to leave this situation, and he knew Gami felt the same. Said man stood next to his successor, up against the wall. There wasn't much space in the office, so the ghost could feel that a portion of his form was more like in the wall. He also wasn't comfortable in the situation and was ready to head out. "Especially you, Midoriya," he continued, despite the growing tension in the small office. "That's a miracle we never expected." The principal's words made him want to puke. He wasn't the quirkless miracle they thought he was. He was strong, he was capable, and he now had the confidence to know that he was all that, even without his powers. Bakugo was also in the office, but stood closer to the principal. His hands were stuffed in his pockets and his shoulders slumped back. Though the blonde hadn't pulled anything too brash since the sludge villain incident, he still wasn't eager to be this close in proximity to him. Eventually, the principal finally stopped talking, and the boy took the opportunity to leave the room. He rushed out of the school, not wanting to be caught with Bakugo. After hours, he passed by the courtyard, and the beautiful tree in the center seemed to wave him goodbye. Of course, he knew it was only the wind, but it was nice to pretend sometimes. He entered his alleyway shortcut like he did every day. It was a long path to take, and it always seemed to be dark no matter the time of day. The alleyway still gave the teen chills, but he was constantly on alert. That was a skill he had gratefully picked up after the sludge villain incident, and it hadn't disappointed him yet. So Midoriya knew that Bakugo had followed him into the alleyway. The teen's loud and harsh footsteps betrayed himself enough, even without his keen sense of observation. That didn't mean he was expecting the blonde to shove him up against a building wall. "What dirty tricks did you use to do it, you quirkless shit?" Bakugo growled and grabbed him by the front of his shirt. He pulled the boy close to his face and yelled again, spit flying everywhere. Midoriya flinched on reflex, shutting his eyes and raising his gloved hands to protect his face. He was more composed around his other peers. But something about the angry blonde just didn't sit right with him. Maybe it was because they were friends at one point. He didn't really know. I was supposed to be the first and only from this shitty school. He continued furiously and thrusted the teen against the wall once more. You've ruined everything. The timid boy looked to Gami, who was desperately trying to pull Bakugo off of him when the spirit finally understood that his arms would not solidify and would only continue to pass through the student. He moved to yank on his successor instead, but the minute the specter lifted his head up slightly and made eye contact with the trapped teen, he hesitated. Something in his friend's eyes screamed at him not to intervene, so he backed off warily, but kept his guard up. But Bakugo didn't catch the little interaction. His tunnel vision was only focused on his rage. I thought I told you not to try for UA. I told you. Midoriya didn't mean to react, honestly, but his body moved before he could think. He grabbed Bakugo's arm, the one holding him against the alleyway wall. Tightly, he burrowed his gloved fingers deep into the uniform's fabric. Half hoping to bruise the skin, the teen still kept his head down during all that. His unruly hair dangled over his eyes and blocked the blonde's startled reaction from his sight. Well, I've got full faith that you'll turn out to be someone great, and if you're planning on going into heroics, then I'll just have to keep an ear out for you. As somebody told me, he started shakily, his heart heavy. I meant what I said when we first met, quirk or not. You are going to be a great hero one day, Midoriya. That I could become a hero. He slammed his feet on the ground, steadying himself. The boy corrected himself. Bakugo, said teen, barely registered the words being said to him. He didn't understand why useless, worthless Deku kept going. All their other classmates had already given up on competing with him, and they had quirks, so why didn't Deku just give up too? Midoriya wasn't sure where this courage was coming from. He had stood up for himself in front of Bakugo before, but it was usually in a more passive way, never something as brash as yelling back though. But he didn't question it, and just let his mouth run. I earned this. Gami certainly wasn't expecting an outburst from his successor, but that didn't mean he wasn't proud. He knew the boy hated confrontation, as well as the attention that followed, but that just made the few times he snapped all the more prideful to watch. The man knew he couldn't force the boy to be more assertive towards Bakugo or the others, but he was glad that he was growing to be more confident at the very least. That's why the teen locked his grip on the blonde's arm and pulled it off of him impulsively. He couldn't stand how aggressive or touchy Bakugo was, always seeming to creep into his personal space to ridicule him or make him feel miserable. After way too many times of him using his quirk on the shoulder where his father's scar lay, he'd grown to dislike any time Bakugo laid his hands on him, whether it was on said scar or not. But right now, he wasn't focused on the blonde's lack of personal awareness. Sure, he had removed the invasive grip on his collar, but that didn't mean he was done yet. He wasn't the useless, worthless Deku that Bakugo thought he was. He was a changed person. The sludge villain incident changed him. Meeting All Might changed him. The entrance exam changed him. Ishihara's death changed him. Gami's consistent support changed him, and Bakugo needed to realize that. He began to distance himself from the blonde. Walking down the alleyway towards the other end, Bakugo, while still in shock, began to go after the teen, but Midoriya quickly turned to face him, his glare stopping the angry boy in his tracks. I'm going to be here no matter what, so get used to it. He didn't need to yell it out or check on Bakugo as he walked out of the alley. He knew the blonde heard him loud and clear. Gami rushed to catch up to the teen. He got to see Bakugo's reaction clearly, and it put a smile on his hidden face. The spirit wasn't expecting such a fierce declaration from his successor, but neither was Bakugo, based on his seething expression. He caught up to the boy right as he turned onto another street, but said boy didn't seem to notice. That was not like you. Midoriya jumped at the sound of his mentor's calm voice. He tightened his grip on his backpack straps. Yes, sorry about that. I did not mean it like that. Not in a bad way anyway. The normally reserved teen looked up at that. Never mind, it was nice to see you stand up for yourself though. And then the teen looked back down bashfully, but regained his composure. I heard enough already from the principal. I didn't want to hear more from Bakugo of all people. I guess that is understandable. The two continued to walk together, but Gami was merely following his successor. He assumed that they were heading home at first, but the boy didn't turn down the street like he was supposed to. The man didn't question it though, and just kept following without a word. As for Midoriya, he really didn't know where he was going. He was simply walking wherever his feet were taking him. He was a bit shaken after the confrontation with Bakugo in the alleyway, but it felt good to finally tell off the blonde. It was something that didn't happen often, but when it did, it felt like striking gold. But his mind was now wandering aimlessly, just like he was. It didn't really matter where he was going, as long as it was away from that alley. He noticed that he had stopped, so he shook himself out of his thoughts and looked up to figure out where exactly he was. He froze when a partially destroyed, quaint, blue house met his gaze. The boy had found himself walking to the house as a force of habit, But as much as he tried not to, he ended up here multiple times a week each time he did. The house's perimeter was blocked off by police tape and would only permit him to come so close, but that wasn't an object of complaint for him. He was quite fine with looking out at the friendly house from a distance. Ending up at Ishihara's home wasn't what made him freeze. What made him freeze was the fact that police tape no longer fenced him out. He took a slow step forward into the area where before the tape hadn't let him cross. He stopped and listened, but there wasn't any sound, no policeman telling him to leave, no bystanders asking him what he was doing, but also no Ishihara calling him to come inside. It was bittersweet, but he was going to take advantage of the fact that no one was going to tell him no. Midoriya made his way up the front stairs, savoring each step on the weathered but homey concrete. His hand moved to brush against the metal rails, and though he couldn't feel the smooth steel, the chill still seeped through his glove. It had been such a while since he had gotten to walk up these steps, and it almost made him burst into tears, but he wasn't going to cry out in public, so he forced the tears back in and continued up. When he finally reached the front door, the teen wasn't sure what to do. He wanted to knock, but he was positive no one would answer. He did remember Ishihara going on about his family, but as far as he knew, the older man lived alone, and if someone did answer, what would he say? There wasn't any real reason he was here, other than the pull of something unnatural. No person in their right mind would let a stranger in for no reason, even if that stranger claimed to know the owner of the house. Izu, what are you doing exactly? I don't really know. But even then, the boy made no effort to remove himself from the property. His instincts were telling him to wait, even if those instincts didn't really know what they were waiting for, but his gut hadn't failed him yet, so he gave the feeling a chance and continued to wait right in front of the door. I really think we should get going. That's when the front door opened. At the door was a woman. She looked older, but definitely not as old as Ishihara, and had long, brown hair that nearly reached her mid-chest. She jumped, not expecting him there, but quickly composed herself. She took up an annoyed stance, almost like it hurt her eyes to look at him. Excuse me, she said snarkily, but what are you doing here? Midoriya hesitated, not expecting someone to open the door either. He began to introduce himself even though she hadn't asked his name. I'm Mai. I know who you are, she interrupted hastily. You quirkless brat, you're wasting my time, so scram. The teen flinched at the declaration. She must live somewhere in the neighborhood then, if she knew he didn't have a quirk, but he still tried to get a word in. Please, Ishihara-san, who was at the door. Both parties stopped at that call, though for completely different reasons, but the woman recovered faster and called back. It's nothing, Takagi, just some quirkless kid, she replied, and then turned to look at the boy, who's about to be leaving. Midoriya shuddered, but didn't move as the unknown voice from before made his way to the front door. Nonsense, Ishihara-san. I'm coming to see for myself, the voice called out again as the footsteps grew louder. The brown-haired woman seemed to grow a shade paler. No, it's fine, really, there's no need. The puzzled teen shared a glance at the specter next to him, who seemed equally lost. The man just shrugged at his successor, at a loss for what to do. Getting no real helpful advice from the ghost, he decided to just wait and see who came to the door. And right at that thought, a black-haired man in fine clothing met his curious gaze. The man's dark brown eyes met his own, and he looked away with embarrassment. He hoped this man was more open to what he had to say, if he could get his timid voice to say anything. Hello, the man began first, to which Midoriya was grateful for. Who might you be? I'm Midoriya Izuku, and I was hoping. Wait, he interrupted. Goodness, was anyone going to let him talk today? Did you say your name was Midoriya Izuku? That made the boy do a double take. Yes, and oh, that's wonderful. The death duo shared another quick look of bewilderment. Before the teen returned his attention to the man in the sharp suit, he was a bit weary of why this man was interested in him. But the cheerful smile in front of him pushed back his worries enough to hear him out. The man must have picked up on his hesitation, because he started to backtrack. Sorry, let me introduce myself. I'm Takagi Masa, and I'm the Ishihara family's executor. He then gestured to the brown-haired woman that had answered the door originally. This is Ishihara Tadao's daughter, Ishihara Kohoni. The newly introduced Kohoni coughed. Takagi, what are you doing? We have work to do. Takagi simply flashed her a bright smile, before continuing on with his tangent. I'm sure you already know, but as the Ishihara family's executor, I'm in charge of making sure that Ishihara Tadao's will is properly taken care of. Midoriya, in fact, did not know this. Between training for UA and keeping out of trouble at Aldera, he hadn't had the chance to brush up on legal studies, but he merely nodded his head and let the man keep talking. Ishihara Tadao did name one Midoriya Izuku in his will, but hadn't left any way to contact him. I was wondering how I was going to get in touch with you, but the universe works in mysterious ways, it seems. That statement definitely caught the teen's interest. Ishihara has left him something in his will. That certainly surprised him, though. He hadn't had the faintest idea of what it could be. Well, why don't you come inside, Midoriya-kun, since we'll need to talk things out. The boy barely croaked out a response. Sure, I guess. Takagi then ushered him inside, to the shock of Kohoni, but she composed herself enough to come back in as well. Gami was left alone, wondering if he should really intrude on a matter this sensitive. But he decided to join his successor just in case. He quickly phased through the door to catch up. By the time he did, Midoriya was now sitting at the home's small dining room table with Takagi. Kohoni observing from the kitchen doorway, he could tell the teen was nearly in tears. And not only because he was finally back in the house, the spirit recalled Ishihara patching up the boy a few years back at that very table, where he later came out as quirkless. That day was momentous to his successor, as he finally had the support of someone other than the ghost himself. But Gami stopped reminiscing when the raven-haired man piped up again. Normally, we wouldn't do things here, he started, but you just so happened to catch Ishihara-san and I finalizing the details of her portion of the will. The teen nodded in understanding, waiting for the man to continue. Luckily, your visit still works out pretty well, since I've already set aside the items bestowed to you. Takagi reached over to a stack of paper on the dining room table and shuffled through them. He pulled out a few sheets from the center and laid them out in front of the boy. He picked them up to examine them, but the man started talking again. Because you're under 18. As the executor, I'm supposed to hold on to your inheritance until you come of age, but the items you've inherited hold little monetary value from a legal standpoint, so I can offer you them now. Midoriya picked out his name in the set of papers that Takagi had handed him. He really was written into Ishihara's will, but he couldn't find what his inheritance was in the mass vomit of words. He looked up to the executor, finally realizing he had stopped talking. Do I need a lawyer for this? The man chuckled. Typically, I would recommend one when dealing with inheritance, but like I said before, what you've inherited is of so little monetary value that it's really not necessary, though. The decision is still entirely up to you. The teen eyed his mentor briefly, hoping that was enough to catch the spirit's attention. Thankfully, it was. I only remember dealing with a few inheritance proceedings in my time, but from what I do know, I think you are all right. He gave a curt nod in acknowledgement before moving to respond. I guess I'm good then. Oh, wonderful. You've saved me quite a bit of time. Midoriya Kuno, I love how clean this is turning out to be. Midoriya, Gami, and Kohoni watched in silence as Takagi sang praises to himself for dealing with a deceased's will. The man was oddly bubbly, but the boy guessed it came with the job. Takagi seemed to realize he was making a scene and calmed himself down enough to continue with the proceeding. Well, Midoriya-kun, follow me. He stood up from his chair, prompting the teen to get up as well. I've laid out your inheritance in the living room. The suited man walked out of the dining room abruptly, so he dashed after him. Gami didn't trail behind as far. Interested to see how the situation played out, the last to leave the room was Kohoni, who was a bit annoyed, but also surprisingly intrigued. The boy had to stop himself, nearly crashing into Takagi. The executor seemed a bit hasty in his actions, and that was starting to get on his nerves. But the man has been nothing but nice to him, so he refused the urge to call him out. He stayed close behind as the man slowly walked into the room, but still couldn't see much. Here it all is, he stated, and moved out of the way, allowing Midoriya a perfect view of the coffee table. On said table was a cardboard box, carefully folded together and taped. Only the top flaps were left open, so he cautiously made his way over to peer inside. Gami too was curious, but opted to let his successor take the first peek. Midoriya wasn't going to lie. He was nervous. He really wasn't sure what to expect in the box, but he knew it wasn't going to be anything bad. He wished he could tell that to his brain, though his hands were shaky and sweaty, and the boy was afraid he wouldn't be able to open the box like this. Still, he willed up any confidence he had left and slowly lifted open the flaps. The first thing that caught his eye was a glint of sunlight. It nearly blinded him, so he had to step back, but upon further examination, there wasn't a miniature sun in the box. Instead, there was something silver that reflected the sunlight coming in from the window. He carefully lifted the silver object out to get a better look, and almost dropped it out of shock. It was a beautiful silver kettle with an antique finish. He quickly switched to holding it by the thin handle as to not smudge the polished surface. It looked so pristine, so he assumed it was unused and kept away in an attic or something. But when he turned it over to check, he could see the scorch marks it wore from time over a stove that nearly brought him to tears. But not for the reasons you'd expect. The searing on the bottom of the kettle merely confirmed to the boy that this was most likely the kettle Ishihara used to prepare tea for the two of them. Clearing his consciousness, he gently set the kettle down onto the coffee table and moved to look in the cardboard box again. Inside, the next thing his eyes picked out was a notebook with a light brown cover, so he wrapped his fingers around the slightly worn spine to pull it out. At first glance, he wasn't sure exactly what the book contained, as it had no words on the cover. So he tenderly flipped through the pages, but he couldn't tell what the book was about even then. So he stopped on a random page to examine the scrawls. After reading the first few lines, he figured out it was a recipe. Going back to look at the other pages, the teen realized that the whole book was full of baking recipes, cookies, and pastries that Ishihara loved to bake and serve when he came over. That actually brought him to tears, so he placed the book down next to the kettle before those droplets fell. Tagaki watched the boy grow more and more emotional at unboxing the items left for him. The executor smiled warmly at the sight. He knew firsthand how emotionally valuable inheritance could be, despite whatever its monetary value was. Honestly, he was glad it wasn't worth much, or else he would have had to hold on to it by the terms of his position. Kohoni was practically indifferent to the situation, but not without curiosity. She wondered what relations this kid had possessed with her father. By now she had lost most of her hostility towards him, but that didn't mean she was eager to be around him. Midoriya figured he had wasted enough of Takagi and Kohoni's time crying, so he wiped his eyes and reached into the cardboard box again. There was one last thing inside, so he grabbed it with both hands and lifted it out. The item was a wooden box, and a bit heavier than he expected. He put the box down onto the coffee table and ran a gloved hand over the smooth wood. It had a golden clasp on the front, so he popped it open and raised the lid. When the sight of the chess set he and Ishihara played with met his gaze, the waterworks went into overdrive. He collapsed onto his knees and held the open box tightly to his chest as he sobbed, startling the two others, as well as the ghost, still in the room. Gami quickly moved into action, floating over to assist in any way he could, but it was Kohoni who actually said the first coherent sentence. "What is it?" She craned her neck to try and get a better look. "A chess set." "Indeed, Ishihara-san," Takagi replied. "That, along with the kettle and recipe book, were specifically left for Midoriya-kun in the will." Said boy seemed to compose himself enough to close the box and get back up on his feet. He sniffled out a quiet "little sorry" before placing the chess set back into the cardboard box. "Nonsense," the suited man interrupted. "These situations are always emotional." The teen rubbed the stray tears from his eyes and wiped his wet hands on his school uniform. He made sure his hands were dry enough before grabbing the recipe book and kettle to put them into the box as well. The brunette woman broke the silence again, her nosiness getting the better of her. "What exactly was your relationship with my father?" Midoriya was startled at the seemingly sincere question directed at him, especially from a person so hostile towards him at first, but he took the time to think about it. There were so many ways he could describe the relationship he had with Ishihara, and yet not enough words. He didn't take too long though, just to ensure the woman's patience didn't run out. He finished packing away the 3 items and shut the cardboard box. He placed a hand onto the top to force the 2 open flaps down. "Ishihara-sen was a really close friend." Kohoni looked shocked. "That's it." The boy laughed and picked up the cardboard box carefully, making sure not to disturb any of the items inside. "Well, I'd like to believe he thought the same of me, but I'm sure he had many friends other than myself." The younger Ishihara scoffed. "Well, obviously," Midoriya continued despite the quip. "And while I'm sure I was not Ishihara-san's first friend, he was most certainly mine." Takagi's smile fell a bit, but he picked it back up before anyone could notice. The brown-haired woman didn't make any outward expressions, but she swore she felt a sharp tug on her heartstrings. Gami wasn't hurt at that declaration. It was technically the truth. The older man was his successor's first human friend. Besides, the Spectre was already aware that he would forever be the odd. The teen paused at that and took a moment to reminisce. Ishihara was a lot of firsts for him. He was the first person he had a premonition about, and the first person he saved. He was the first person who had ever invited him over, and the first person to bake treats for him. He was the first person who had ever patched him up, and the first person who supported his dreams. The boy held the cardboard box close to his chest, squeezing it tightly in his arms. "I'm really thankful to have known him." The first day of UA arrived faster than Midoriya thought it would. But he was ready. He set his phone alarm early for that morning, even earlier than he normally got up for his deathly duties. He wanted to give himself plenty of time to pack and prepare. The last thing he wanted to do was arrive late on the very first day. Gami had helped him pack the night before though, so he didn't feel at all stressed waking up this morning. He straightened out his new UA uniform, the gray, a nice change from the black of Alder. The spirit had attempted to teach the boy how to do his tie, but his efforts were fruitless. He still walked out of the house that morning with a poorly done, fat tie, as well as his signature red sneakers and his black leather bag. The subway ride didn't feel as long as it was, and evidently enough, the duo walked down the beautiful path they had taken before for the entrance exams just as the teen had hoped. The trees now grew luscious green leaves on their branches and framed the walkway luxuriously. He almost wished he could spend the whole day out here, but knew that wasn't an option. He calmly strolled down the halls of the prestigious school. Looking for his class, he had studied the map that came with the acceptance letter, but still managed to forget where he was going in the awe of observing every nook and cranny. Thankfully, the ghost had looked at the map as well, and was now leading the boy down the right hall. The two finally arrived at a large door that read "Wanna" on it in big, bold lettering. They both stopped to stare mesmerizingly at it. "Well, that is certainly one massive entryway," Midoriya chuckled. "It has to be accessible to everyone, no matter their quirks." But after that, he felt his laughter die off to replace his nervousness. Once he entered that classroom, he'd be in a room full of the best of the best. That thought made his heart sputter. Did he deserve to be here? Even though he technically didn't have a quirk, he did have powers. Did that make his acceptance count? Or was it a petty excuse? What if he was taking this spot from someone else who really deserved it? His head started to spiral again, but Gami caught it before he could fall any deeper. Just remember that you earned your spot here. He spoke softly. You took the same exam as everyone else, and you came out on the very top. The boy smiled up at his mentor. Yeah, you're right. He moved his gloved hands to grip at the sliding door and pulled it open slowly. His mind drifted back to Bakugo in the moment, as well as the other kid that embarrassed him from the entrance exam, but he shook it off the best he could. Let's just hope they're in the other class, he remarked to no one. Who? And that's when the door opened up all the way to reveal the blue-haired boy yelling strictly at Bakugo right near the front of the room. Never mind, I think I know who. Remove your foot from that desk. The strict boy from the exam berated. Such an action is insulting to those who came to UA before us as well as the craftsmen who made the desk. Like I care, the blonde scoffed, not moving his foot. What middle school are you from? Extra. Midoriya deadpanned. It was just his luck that both kids happened to be in his class. He wasn't sure how he'd deal with Bakugo, but he hoped at the very least he could get on good terms with the other boy. Said boy gasped at Bakugo's response, but answered the question. I'm from Sumi Private Academy. My name is Idatenya. Sumi, he repeated with a smug grin. A stuck-up elitist? Then I should blow you to bits. Ida grew even more flabbergasted. Blow me to bits? Do you really wish to become a hero? It was then that Ida noticed the green-haired boy standing nervously in the doorway. He shuffled over to him to introduce himself again. Oh dear, I'm from Sumi Private Academy. The teen started again. Ah, I heard you from before, he interrupted, not really wanting to hear the same spiel from before. I'm Midoriya Izuku, pleased to meet you. Midoriya, Ida mumbled out, causing said teen to flinch. That name reminded him too much of home. Maybe he could get his classmates to call him by a nickname or something. You perceived the true nature of that practical exam while I did not. The reserve boy and his mentor shared a look. He hadn't really perceived anything during the exam. He simply did what was right. He couldn't just stand and watch as the nice brunette got hurt, or as the giant robot tore up the mock city. He wasn't expecting to get any points, much less 60 rescue points, but he wasn't complaining. I misjudged you. Goodness, was that boy still talking? I hate to admit it, but you were the superior candidate. Ah, well, I only did what I thought was right, he whispered, not enjoying the attention he was getting from the other kids in the classroom. I'm going to go sit down now. He started walking away from the blunt male. This was definitely not how he wanted to start his first day. But if he walked away from the spotlight now, there was still a chance he could get away with a quiet rest of the day, though. It didn't seem like the universe wanted that for him, because just as he attempted to move away from it, the class door opened again. That curly hair, it's you. Midoriya recognized the voice, but he still jolted from surprise. He turned around and sure enough, it was the nice girl from the entrance exam. He smiled softly and tried to make his way to his seat. The brunette didn't seem to realize his discomfort though, and walked right up to him. You got in, just like President Mike said. She cheered enthusiastically, pumping her fist into the air. It makes sense though. That swing was awesome. The timid teen grew more nervous at her loud and bubbly personality, but at feeling the ghost run a cold, bony hand through his hair, he calmed down enough to respond. Well, I have to thank you for speaking on my behalf. Gami just listened as the talkative girl rambled on and on to his successor. He took the time to examine the other kids in the classroom. There were certainly a variety of quirks, to say the least, and each student looked unique, but his gaze inevitably landed on the seething blonde. The spirit could tell Bakugo wasn't happy about the arrival of his friend, but he hadn't made any attempts to quip at him yet, much less attack him. That was definitely an improvement from Aldra, so the Spectre wasn't too upset. So we got our entrance ceremony and guidance sessions today, right? Gami wondered if all these kids just liked to talk, or if his successor was just quieter than he thought, but nonetheless, she hadn't waited for a response before continuing. I wonder what our teacher will be like. Boy, am I nervous. Midoriya chuckled nervously. He felt the same way, but he was eager to go sit down. They were still at the front of the classroom, and he could feel the eyes on the two of them. He wondered where the teacher was, considering he still wasn't in the classroom yet. If you're here to socialize, then get out. Ah, speak of the devil and he shall appear. He watched the brunette turn around towards the open door in shock, and he turned to look as well, and while he didn't know what to expect considering his homeroom teacher, he certainly wasn't prepared to see a haggard-looking man wrapped up in a yellow sleeping bag. He pulled his hand out of the bag, along with what looked to be a juice pouch. He gave the pouch a nice, long suck. Before moving to stand up, he unzipped the sleeping bag and let it fall to his feet, revealing his outfit, which consisted of a black jumpsuit and a familiar gray scarf. Oh my god, that's Pro Hero Eraserhead. The teen's analytic mind snapped into overdrive. This is certainly interesting. It took 8 seconds for you to quiet down, the rugged man stated bluntly. Time is a precious resource. You lot aren't very rational, are you? The class didn't really know how to react to the man, or his declaration. Many simply gaped like fish. The man didn't waste any time though and continued talking. I'm your homeroom teacher, Aizawa Shota, pleased to meet you. Once the man introduced himself, Midoriya was sure he was a racerhead if the scarf didn't give him away. The name surely did. He was arguably the boy's favorite underground hero ever, and had a few pages in a notebook dedicated to him, his quirk, and his fighting style. Of course, it was unlikely that his other classmates had ever heard of him, since he really tried to stay out of the media spotlight. But he wasn't about to call the man out, since the teacher obviously didn't introduce himself as a racerhead for some reason. "Change into your gym clothes and out to the grounds," he said. Not skipping a beat, "Your clothes should be in a locker assigned to you in the class locker rooms." The teen didn't want to be the first person to leave the room, so he hesitated and let Ada, along with some other students, leave first before following them to the locker room. "That was a racerhead, correct?" Gami inquired. He nodded subtly. Trying not to draw any attention to himself, he walked into the locker room and looked for his own. All of the lockers had numbers plated onto them, but also had sticky notes as well. He assumed that the sticky notes had their names on them, so he searched for his, finally finding it. He opened the door to see his gym clothes, which were a dark blue with white lines that spelled out the school's initials. Quickly unfolding them, he realized the tops were short-sleeved. Luckily, he had come prepared just in case. Placing his backpack into the locker, he opened it and pulled out a black, long-sleeved turtleneck. He had purchased a few more of these shirts, thin and moisture-wicking for any sort of summer activities. He had placed one of them in his bag in the event he needed it for school. Not really expecting to be out on the grounds on the first day, though. Midoriya closed his locker and moved towards the bathroom stalls. All the other boys were changing out in the open, but he wasn't too keen on revealing his scars. He knew the burn one would attract a lot of attention at the very least, and that was definitely something he didn't want. He knew some kids were giving him weird looks, but he tried not to pay any attention. He opened one of the stall doors and walked in with his gym clothes and turtleneck. "It was a good thing you decided to bring that with you." The teen hummed out a noise of approval. Taking off his uniform top to slip on the turtleneck, the neck was tall enough to cover the bit of the burn scar that peeked out of his uniform, and the sleeves reached all the way to his wrist to shield his other injuries from view, and that was just the way he liked it. "Do not let them get to you. They are just being curious." "I know," he whispered under his breath. He figured there would be stares if he decided not to change out in the open, so he wasn't too surprised when he was proven correct. That was simply the nature of curiosity. When someone acts out of the ordinary, it draws attention. He was used to it, though. One stare remained on him a bit longer than the others, and returned once. He left the stall as well. The boy didn't notice it, but Gami certainly did at first. The old ghost assumed it was Bakugo, but a certain head of candy cane hair made him reassess his initial assumptions. A quirk test. Midoriya had hung around the back of the class. Once he got outside, he wore the gym clothes just like everyone else, just with his black turtleneck underneath. It covered the parts of his neck and arms that his gym uniform did not, paired with his usual black polyester gloves, and he was comfortable and ready to go. He and Gami tuned into the conversation currently playing out. "What about the entrance ceremony? Or the guidance sessions?" He heard the nice brunette from before exclaim he really needed to learn her name. "You don't have time to waste on that stuff if you want to become heroes," Aizawa began. At that, hushed murmurs grew from the class, so the teacher proceeded speaking. "UA is known for its freestyle educational system," he continued, and the whispers died down. "That applies to us teachers as well." Aizawa walked over to what the teen presumed to be an area for softball throwing, and beckoned the class to follow. The new first years shuffled over nervously, including Midoriya. Just because he knew that man was a racerhead didn't make him any less intimidating. Actually, the pro was probably more intimidating with the knowledge that he was such a scarily effective underground hero, despite his non-offensive quirk. Softball throwing, standing long jump, 50-meter dash, endurance running. The boy was confused at first why the hero was listing basic exercises, but he then realized that those were the kind of tests that he had done in gym class back at Aldera. Of course, he didn't say anything, and the teacher continued. Grip strength, side-to-side stepping, upper body training, seated toe touch. He looked towards his mentor, who seemed a bit puzzled. I guess it was fair to assume the man didn't perform anything like standardized athletics testing during his adolescence. He doubted there even was standardized athletics testing 5 centuries ago. "You all did these in middle school?" "Yes." Aizawa addressed the confused looks in the crowd. "Your standard, no quirks allowed gym tests." The homeroom teacher scoffed seemingly at his own statement. "This country still insists on prohibiting quirks when calculating the averages of those records. It's not rational. The Department of Education is simply procrastinating." Midoriya couldn't deny what the pro was saying. The education system was sorely behind when it came to implementing transitions for quirks in the classroom. He remembered Aldera's rules when it came to quirks, not only the ones pertaining to use in general. His middle school allowed a lot of unfair treatment depending on the quirk. A student had Bakugo and himself were prime examples. He had hoped for some changes while he was still in middle school, whether by Aldera or by the department themselves. But he knew not to expect anything. As they say, hope for the best and expect the worst. "Midoriya," Aizawa called out, startling the boy out of his thoughts. "Where are you?" Right here, sir, he responded passively. Moving to the front of the crowd, Gami moved up with him, passing right through the other students. The tired-looking hero eyed his extra clothing, but chose not to call him out instead. He continued on his tangent. You came first in the entrance exam, correct? The gruff man didn't wait for a response. How far could you throw in middle school? The teen shuffled a bit at being called out, and grew more nervous at the whispers. Coming from his classmates, he picked at his gloved fingers in an attempt to calm himself down. 46 meters, sir. Great, now try it with your quirk, do whatever you need to, just don't leave the circle. He simply nodded and walked into the circle drawn on the ground. Aizawa tossed him the ball and he caught it snappily. He could pick out Bakugo's voice yell out loudly over the crowd. What's Deku gonna do? He's just a quirkless runt. Ada stepped right in to defend him. Quirkless? So you haven't heard about his feats during the entrance exam? The two then devolved into squabbles, but Midoriya tried not to listen and he was stressed enough as it was. Gami ran a hand through his successor's hair, hoping to ease him. The pro seemed to have caught on to the boy's hesitation, so he added a short comment of encouragement. Give it all you got. He nodded softly at the advice and tossed the ball from hand to hand. He opted to take off his gloves, but decided against it. Deeming it not necessary, he quickly glanced to the side to look at his mentor, who stood outside the circle as to not get in his way. Do not worry about Bakugo or the others, the spirit reassured. This is your next step. Yeah, the teen mumbled. He shook off his nervousness. For now, he didn't want to waste any more of his teacher's time. He had done enough hesitating, so he decided to just jump in head first. He threw the ball directly above him, as high as he could. He could hear the startled gasps from his classmates, as they were most likely assuming he would throw it forward, but he didn't have any time to think about them. He was completely focused on launching this ball as far as he could. This was his shot, and he was going to take it. As the ball was in the air, Midoriya flexed his right hand and summoned his scythe, quickly grabbing it with his other hand. He lifted it behind his head. He only had a single moment before the ball fell back down, but he poured as much DT as he could into his weapon. He could also hear the breaths of shock at the sight of the massive scythe, but he ignored them as well. He could feel a tiny tingle at the base of his spine, but paid it little attention. The teen watched the ball begin to fall back down to earth. He was hoping to pull the same stunt he used to take down the 0-pointer, so once the ball got right where he wanted it, he let his weapon come down. I'll prove my worth right here and now. He knew the scythe didn't hit the ball, but that was his plan. He could hear his class yell and cry in surprise as his weapon audibly tore through the air, and just like the swing with the 0-pointer, a loud explosion rang as shockwave sent the ball flying. It took a few seconds, but eventually the ball came crashing down. A few beeps came from Aizawa's direction, so he turned to look and faced the shocked expressions of his classmates. It's important for us to know our limits. The teacher started up. He showed the crowd, as well as Midoriya, the monitor that recorded his score. The screen flashed and then showed an impressive score of 1,139.6 meters. That's the first rational step towards figuring out what kind of heroes you'll be. Aizawa was arguably more shocked than the other kids, but not for the same reasons. He flashed his own quirk right as Midoriya had swung his weapon, and was flabbergasted that nothing had happened. He wasn't sure how that was even possible. Since his quirk was obviously not a mutant one, he was going to have to pull the kid after the tests and take him to Nezu for an explanation, but right now, he kept himself composed and proceeded with his plans. Bakugo would probably give the pro a run for his money, though he was completely bewildered at what had just happened before his eyes, but his shock quickly turned to rage as his palms started sparking. What the hell? Explain yourself, Deku. The blonde screamed as he charged at the shy boy with his explosions firing off in every direction. Midoriya flinched and his sight disappeared. Out of stress, he raised his gloved hands to shield his face from the incoming attack. He didn't notice that the tips of his gloves started to disintegrate without him meaning to. Gami initially shied away from the amount of light being produced, but he sprung into action. He figured he wasn't going to turn solid to stop Bakugo, so he prepared himself to yank his successor out of the way. It was then that the blonde was halted in his tracks, a few strands of cloth wrapping themselves around his body. His explosions also stopped completely, but he didn't seem to realize that. What the? He grimaced. This cloth is stiff. It's a capture weapon made of carbon fibers and a special alloy wire, Aizawa corrected. And geez, stop using your quirk already. That was when Bakugo realized his explosions had stopped. He looked back at the teacher, but continued to struggle against his bind. I'm getting serious dry eye over here. Midoriya moved a bit away from the raging blonde, but let his excitement take over at seeing his favorite underground hero in action. Wow, you really are a racerhead. The class began whispering again. And that's when the teen realized he had just said that out loud. He looked down embarrassingly as the pro released Bakugo from his capture weapon. So you know of me, kid? The teacher questioned. I try to stay out of the media. Well, your quirk is pretty interesting, he mumbled. And I do analysis as a hobby. He didn't say any more than that, so Aizawa proceeded to get the rest of the test going. He could tell this was going to be a long day. The boy returned to the group, where he was swamped by Ada, the brunette, and a few other classmates. "Well," she cried, "now that's a hero-like record if I ever saw one." "Indeed," Ada observed, thinking back on the entrance exam. "That is certainly a strange but powerful quirk." Midoriya smiled and thanked them for their nice words, but was eager to be out of the spotlight. "Nice swing, you are getting better at that move," he huffed in content at the ghost, but made it seem as if he was panting for breath. The class seemed to realize that the tension from before was gone, and immediately grew excited at the prospect of using their quirks. Comments flew left and right from the rest of the students. "Whoa, this is awesome. 1,139 meters. Seriously? So we can use our quirks for real. Man, the hero course is great. This is going to be fun." Both the teen and his mentor noticed how annoyed their teacher was growing. The Spectre personally knew that look the man was giving, and figured he was just about to snap. "Fun, you say?" he stated eerily. Aizawa turned slowly to stare at the group of first years and loomed over them. He held up his hand to examine it, but neither of the death duo could figure out why. Midoriya believed it was symbolic, Gami believed it was personal. "You're hoping to become heroes after 3 years here," he growled lowly. "And you think it'll be all fun and games?" The class shut up at that, but it was too late. Everyone could tell the mood shifted again, and their teacher was pissed. "All right then," Aizawa replied sarcastically. "The one with the lowest score across all 8 events will be judged as hopeless." He could hear the cries of protests begin to emerge at his declaration, but it would not change his mind. They had pushed the normally nonchalant pro over the edge, and will be expelled.